The invasion of Vekta and the landing of the Helghast forces on the ISA colonies introduces the lore of the shattered peace of the Alpha Centauri. This is the moment where the Cold War of the stars turns into a solar holocaust, representing the orbital sovereignty of the Helghast. The lore suggests that the Helghast are not just invaders, but exiles returning to claim a birthright stolen by the Earth-backed ISA, representing the interplanetary sovereignty of the Vengeance. For Captain Jan Templar, the opening bombardment is the lore of the collapse of the colonial security. He finds that the advanced technology of Vekta is useless against the industrial brutality of the Helghast. This is the lore of the Steel Rain, where the planet becomes the sacrament of the trench warfare. It proves that the ISA defense force was blind to the hate, turning the Vekta city streets into a casket of the diplomatic failure. The lore of the Helghan history and the solar exile provides the lore of the biological divergence of the outcast. After losing the First Helghan War, the original colonists were banished to the toxic, resource-poor planet Helghan, representing the environmental sovereignty of the mutation. The lore suggests that the harsh atmosphere and heavy gravity turned them into a new species with leather-like skin and respirator-dependent lungs, representing the atmospheric sovereignty of the Helghan. This is the lore of the birth of the master race. It suggests that hardship is the foundry of the power. This represents the evolutionary sovereignty of the Scolar Visari. The lore of the gas mask is the lore of the industrial uniform. It hides the human face to reveal the weaponized identity, turning the biology of the soldier into a sacrament of the resilience, where the man becomes the engine of the state. The encounter with Luger and the Shadow Marshal Division introduces the lore of the invisible war of the ISA. Luger, a former lover of Templar and a specialist in assassination and infiltration, represents the subversive sovereignty of the intelligence. Her lore is defined by the sovereignty of the knife in the dark. She does not hold the line. She bleeds the enemy from the inside, representing the tactical sovereignty of the Shadow Marshal. This is the lore of the cold utility. It suggests that peace requires the acts of the cowardice performed by the brave. This represents the clandestine sovereignty of the Vekta. The lore of the Shadow Marshal is the lore of the necessary evil. You must kill the leaders to save the followers, proving that your sovereignty is precise. This highlights the moral ambiguity of the special ops, turning the infiltrated base into a sacrament of the silence. The lore of the Helghast Blitzkrieg and the SD platforms provides the lore of the mechanical betrayal of the Vekta. The Helghast victory is secured by sabotaging the strategic defense platforms from within, representing the traitorous sovereignty of the General Atoms. The lore suggests that the greatest shield of the planet was lowered by a hand of its own people. This is the lore of the internal rot. It suggests that technology is a weakness if the loyalty is purchased. This represents the political sovereignty of the sabotage. The lore of the SD platform is the lore of the falling sky. It turns the orbital laser into a sacrament of the execution, proving that your sovereignty is vulnerable to the greed. This highlights the fragile nature of the colonial power, turning the command center into a casket of the strategic hubris, where the protectors become the targets. The introduction of Rico Velasquez and the heavy weapons doctrine introduces the lore of the brutal honesty of the frontline. Rico, a survivor of a slaughtered squad, represents the physical sovereignty of the direct confrontation. His lore is defined by the sovereignty of the chain gun. He does not think, he overwhelms, representing the destructive sovereignty of the infantry. This is the lore of the unfiltered rage. It suggests that diplomacy is dead, and the only language left is the caliber of the bullet. This represents the visceral sovereignty of the grunt. The lore of the heavy gunner is the lore of the human tank. You must stand in the open to close the gap, proving that your sovereignty is resilient. This highlights the sensory overload of the war zone, turning the trench combat into a sacrament of the attrition, where the hero is measured by the body count. The presence of the Helghast propaganda and the voice of Visari introduces the lore of the oratory sovereignty of the autocracy. Throughout the ruins of Vekta, the giant screens and loudspeakers broadcast the manifesto of the Scolar Visari, representing the psychological sovereignty of the great leader. The lore suggests that Visari did not create the anger. He gave it a voice, representing the charismatic sovereignty of the fascism. This is the lore of the collective will. It suggests that the individual is nothing compared to the glory of the Helghan. This represents the sociological sovereignty of the state. The lore of the prophecy is the lore of the inevitable conquest. It infects the mind before the bullet hits the heart, proving that your sovereignty is intellectual, turning the war into a sacrament of the faith, where the enemy is a holy crusader. For the Templar of the opening parts, the world is the testing of the tactical sanity. You realize that the world is being replaced by the steel. The lore suggests that Jan is the logic in the chaos. You are the only mind that coordinates the misfits to hold the line. The city is not a home. It is a grid of the kill zones that you must navigate with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the gathering of the squad so vital. You are building a republic out of a medic, a spy, and a brute. You look at the Helghast flag, knowing that it is the only banner that the history has left to shadow the Vekta. The Golden Age is a silence between the mortar rounds, and you are the only will left to lead the defense of the last bastion. As this first segment of the history concludes, Templar stands in the ruins of the ISA headquarters, the smoke of the invasion filling the sky. Behind lies the shattered piece of the Alpha Centauri. Before stands the mystery of the traitor and the gathering of the four heroes. The air is no longer tense with the anticipation, but heavy with the smell of the cordite and the ash. You have seen the orbital sovereignty, the biological divergence, and the subversive war of the Shadow Marshal. The lore of Killzone has shifted from the surprise of the attack to the sovereignty of the resistance. You realize that the planet is dying. You look at the orange glow of the enemy eyes, knowing that you are finally the only barrier to the extinction. The Golden Age is a red sky over a gray world, and you are the only power left to shatter the mask of the Helghast. The descent into the Vektan jungles and the expansion of the theater of operations introduces the lore of the primal conflict of the colony. As the ISA survivors retreat into the deep foliage to bypass the Helghast blockade, the environment shifts from urban order to biological anarchy, representing the environmental sovereignty of the terrestrial chaos. The lore suggests that Vekta was engineered for the comfort, but the jungle remains the unconquered spirit of the planet. For the squad, this is the lore of the deconstruction of the military form. They find that the clean uniforms and ISA technology are fettered by the vines and the mud, representing the atmospheric sovereignty of the wild. This is the lore of the Green Purgatory, where the soldier must regress to the hunter to survive the industrialized predator. It proves that the colonial dream is fragile, turning the rainforest canopy into a casket of the civilized illusion. The encounter with Gregor Haka and the revelation of the Helghast half-breed provides the lore of the genetic schism of the loyalty. Haka, a Helghast intelligence officer of pure human appearance, represents the biological sovereignty of the in-between. His lore is defined by the sovereignty of the double agent. He belongs to neither the Helghan nor the Vekta, representing the existential sovereignty of the hybrid. This is the lore of the shattered heritage. It suggests that race is a weapon used by both sides to define the enemy. This represents the intellectual sovereignty of the resistance. The lore of the Haka's defection is the lore of the internal conflict of the soul. He chooses the law over the blood, proving that his sovereignty is moral, turning the squad dynamic into a sacrament of the suspicion, where the enemy becomes the guide. The lore of the Helghast jungle snipers and the shadow infiltration provides the lore of the stealth sovereignty of the guerrilla. The Helghast forces, utilizing active camouflage and silent weaponry, represent the tactical adaptability of the invader. The lore suggests that the exiles have learned to love the dark, representing the predatory sovereignty of the Helghan. This is the lore of the hidden kill zone. It suggests that war is not found in the open, but in the silence of the leaves. This represents the clandestine sovereignty of the Lente. The lore of the sniper is the lore of the invisible death. You must see the unseen to keep your life, proving that your sovereignty is perceptual. This highlights the paranoid nature of the jungle war, turning the crossing of the bridge into a sacrament of the vigilance, where the hero is hunted by the shadow. The introduction of General Lente and the doctrine of the total annihilation provides the lore of the brutal paternity of the conquest. Lente, the field commander of the invasion, represents the physical sovereignty of the Helghast might. His lore is defined by the sovereignty of the Iron Fist. He does not negotiate, he erases, representing the strategic sovereignty of the Visari. This is the lore of the colonial executioner. It suggests that Vekta is not a battlefield, but a crime scene waiting to happen. This represents the totalitarian sovereignty of the occupation. The lore of the Lente's command is the lore of the arrogance of the victor. It reminds the ISA that they are soft and undeserving of the stars, proving that your sovereignty is measured in the iron, turning the jungle base into a sacrament of the might, where the law is subject to the strength. The presence of the ancient Vektan ruins provides the lore of the archaeological sovereignty of the failure. Finding the shattered temples of the original indigenous inhabitants represents the historical sovereignty of the displacement. The lore suggests that the humanity is just the latest invader on a planet of the ghosts. This is the lore of the cyclical extinction. It suggests that victory is temporary, and the land eventually eats the conqueror. This represents the elemental sovereignty of the Vekta. The lore of the ruins is the lore of the silent warning. It reminds the player that stones outlast states, proving that your sovereignty is fleeting. This highlights the melancholic nature of the conflict, turning the firefight in the temple into a sacrament of the forgotten, where the soldiers fight over dirt that has already seen the end. The lore of the Helghast leech technology introduces the lore of the parasitic sovereignty of the resource theft. The Helghast deploy mobile extraction units to strip the Vekta of its energy, representing the industrial sovereignty of the colonial rape. The lore suggests that the invasion is a mining operation disguised as a war, representing the economic sovereignty of the Helghan. This is the lore of the mechanical hunger. It suggests that the exile is starving and the Vekta is the meal. This represents the capitalist sovereignty of the Visari. The lore of the leech is the lore of the draining of the life. It bleeds the planet to fuel the fleet, proving that your sovereignty is logistical. This highlights the desperate nature of the enemy, turning the sabotage mission into a sacrament of the preservation, where the hero must cut the vein to save the heart. For the Haka of the jungle era, the world is the testing of the racial integrity. You realize that the world is defined by the goggles. The lore suggests that Haka is the truth in the mask. You are the only mind that understands the language of the killer while sharing the blood of the victim. The jungle is not a maze. It is a testing ground of the allegiance that you must navigate with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the saving of Templar so complex. You are betraying your species to save your humanity. You look at the Helghast sigil, knowing that it is the only mark that the history has left to birth the hate. The Golden Age is a whisper in the dark, and you are the only note left to signal the end of the Lente's ambition. As this second segment of the history concludes, the squad stands at the edge of the marshlands, the jungle humming with the movement of the Helghast. Behind lies the primal conflict of the colony. Before stands the swamps of the Vekta and the betrayal of the High Command. The air is no longer tense with the foliage, but heavy with the smell of the stagnant water and the treason. You have seen the genetic schism, the doctrine of the total annihilation, and the historical sovereignty of the displacement. The lore of Killzone has shifted from the sovereignty of the resistance to the sovereignty of the treachery. You realize that the traitor is closer than the enemy. You look at the mist on the water, knowing that you are finally the only truth in a world of the masks. The Golden Age is a gray fog over a green hell, and you are the only hand left to expose the heart of the traitor. The trek through the Vektan marshlands and the desperate defense of the shoreline introduces the lore of the stagnant purgatory of the ISA defense. As the squad moves through the waist-deep waters and rotting mangroves, the environment represents the decaying sovereignty of the colonial infrastructure. The lore suggests that the marshes are the waste bin of the Vekta, where the beauty of the planet turns into a clutching mud that consumes the machines of war, representing the geological sovereignty of the swamp. For Templar and his squad, this is the lore of the loss of the high ground. They find that the Helghast hovercraft and respirator technology give the enemy a sovereign advantage in the filth, representing the amphibious sovereignty of the invader. This is the lore of the sinking resistance, where the soldier must fight the gravity of the planet as much as the bullet of the enemy, turning the marshland path into a casket of the logistics. The siege of the ISA coastal base provides the lore of the industrialized slaughter of the garrison. This base, intended to be a shield of the sea, represents the defensive sovereignty of the old world. The lore suggests that the ISA relied too heavily on concrete and turrets, while the Helghast utilized atmospheric superiority and waves of conscripts, representing the asymmetrical sovereignty of the Visari. This is the lore of the breach of the threshold. It suggests that safety is an illusion of the architecture. This represents the surgical sovereignty of the Lente. The lore of the coastal massacre is the lore of the end of the professional soldier. You find the broken bodies of the young recruits who believed in the uniform, proving that your sovereignty is the only weapon left to avenge the innocents, turning the burning ramparts into a sacrament of the vengeance. The encounter with the Helghast elites provides the lore of the apex soldiers of the Helghan. These troops, distinguished by their intricate mask designs and superior ballistic armor, represent the tactical sovereignty of the chosen few. Their lore is defined by the sovereignty of the indoctrination. They are not drafted. They are forged in the fire of the Helghan's toxic wastes, representing the biological sovereignty of the superiority. This is the lore of the unflinching executioner. It suggests that the virus of the fascism has reached its final form in these men. This represents the elite sovereignty of the state. The lore of the elite duel is the lore of the wall of the lead. You must outthink the machine to break the line, proving that your sovereignty is instinctual. This highlights the terrifying precision of the enemy, turning the mud-caked trenches into a sacrament of the reflex. The lore of the Helghast Maw artillery introduces the lore of the auditory sovereignty of the terror. Throughout the marshes, the thump of the heavy long-range cannons creates a rhythm of the death, representing the ballistic sovereignty of the siege. The lore suggests that the Helghast do not fight for the ground. They liquidate the space, representing the industrial sovereignty of the Scolar Visari. This is the lore of the erasure of the horizon. It suggests that distance is no longer a protection. This represents the technological sovereignty of the Lente. The lore of the Maw is the lore of the falling earth. It turns the sky into a hammer to shatter the will of the defender, proving that your sovereignty is small under the weight of the shells. This highlights the overwhelming power of the invader, turning the swamp trek into a sacrament of the endurance. The lore of the abandoned ISA biolabs provides the lore of the ethical erosion of the Vekta. Finding the secret research hidden in the marshes reveals that the ISA was developing the toxins to kill the Helghast biology, representing the chemical sovereignty of the biowarfare. The lore suggests that the democracy was preparing the genocide before the dictatorship arrived, representing the hypocritical sovereignty of the High Command. This is the lore of the mirror of the sin. It suggests that war turns the doctor into a sacrament of the plague. This represents the scientific sovereignty of the fear. The lore of the biolab is the lore of the poison truth. It reminds the player that moral superiority is the first casualty of the survival, proving that your sovereignty is tainted, turning the laboratory investigation into a sacrament of the disillusionment. The presence of the Luger stealth doctrine in the marshlands provides the lore of the subversive sovereignty of the ghost. In the narrow, foggy waterways, the shadow marshal becomes the apex predator, representing the asymmetrical sovereignty of the infiltration. The lore suggests that one woman can undo the work of 1,000 soldiers if she owns the dark. This is the lore of the silent liberation. It suggests that power is vulnerable at the throat. This represents the assassination sovereignty of the Vekta. The lore of the Luger path is the lore of the ripple in the water. You must kill without the sound to protect the loud, proving that your sovereignty is subtle. This highlights the vampiric nature of the guerrilla war, turning the mist-covered bayou into a sacrament of the predation. For the Rico of the Marsh era, the world is the testing of the heavy resolve. You realize that the world is sinking in the blood. The lore suggests that Rico is the anchor in the mud. You are the only shield that stops the advance, while the water clogs the gears. The marsh is not a place. It is a gravity of the death that you must resist with your very muscle. This perspective is what makes the defense of the base so personal. You are becoming the wall to save the cowards. You look at the dead ISA recruits, knowing that they are the only cost that the High Command is willing to pay. The Golden Age is a red glow of the overheating barrel, and you are the only heat left to boil the Helghast in their own water. As this third segment of the history concludes, the squad stands at the gate of the mountain pass, the marshland echoing with the screams of the dying coastal guard. Behind lies the stagnant purgatory of the ISA defense. Before stands the frozen heights of the Vekta and the final duel with General Lente. The air is no longer tense with the humidity, but cold with the certainty of the endgame. You have seen the industrialized slaughter, the apex soldiers of the Helghan, and the ethical erosion of the Vekta. The lore of Killzone has shifted from the sovereignty of the treachery to the sovereignty of the attrition. You realize that the traitor Adams is watching. You look at the snow on the peaks, knowing that you are finally the final storm of the Vekta. The Golden Age is a black smoke over a white mountain, and you are the only flame left to ignite the heart of the resistance. The ascent into the Vektan mountain peaks and the breach of the high-altitude Helghast fortifications introduces the lore of the vertical sovereignty of the Helghan siege. As the squad climbs above the clouds, the environment shifts from biological decay to mechanical isolation, representing the atmospheric sovereignty of the predator. The lore suggests that the Helghast feel at home in the thin air and freezing temperatures, as it mirrors the hostile skies of Helghan, representing the extraterrestrial sovereignty of the exiles. For Templar, this climb is the lore of the thinning of the hope. He finds that the geography is the final ally of the invader. This is the lore of the frozen purgatory, where the soldier must fight the oxygen deprivation as much as the Helghast sniper, turning the mountain pass into a casket of the high-altitude logistics. The clash with the Helghast airborne and the jetpack units provides the lore of the gravity-defying supremacy of the Helghan. These specialized troops, soaring over the precipices to drop grenades into the ISA ranks, represent the aerial sovereignty of the Blitzkrieg. Their lore is defined by the sovereignty of the high ground. It suggests that the Helghast have conquered the sky to look down on the humanity, representing the technological sovereignty of the Visari. This is the lore of the descending death. It suggests that cover is useless when the enemy attacks from the zenith. This represents the kinetic sovereignty of the Lente. The lore of the airborne skirmish is the lore of the battle for the horizon. You must shoot the sky to stay on the ground, proving that your sovereignty is grounded and resilient. The infiltration of the mountain fortress provides the lore of the industrialized paranoia of the occupation. This massive structure, carved directly into the Vektan stone, represents the architectural sovereignty of the Iron Fist. The lore suggests that the Helghast do not inhabit a planet. They fortify it, representing the structural sovereignty of the Scolar Visari. This is the lore of the stone grave. It suggests that freedom is erased by the concrete. This represents the totalitarian sovereignty of the masonry. The lore of the fortress interior is the lore of the geometry of the control. You find the holding cells for the Vektan dissidents, proving that your sovereignty is the only key left to open the prison, turning the industrial corridors into a sacrament of the liberation. The final confrontation with General Lente provides the lore of the violent conclusion of the field command. In the heart of the mountain, the squad finally corners the architect of the Vektan ground invasion, representing the physical sovereignty of the retribution. Lente's lore is defined by the sovereignty of the disdain. Even at the end, He views the ISA as weaklings who stole the wealth of the stars, representing the political sovereignty of the Helghast grievance. This is the lore of the dying general. It suggests that hatred is a fuel that burns out the engine. This represents the mortal sovereignty of the autocracy. The lore of the Lente's death is the lore of the decapitation of the army. You realize that killing the man does not stop the machine, but it shatters the ego of the Helghan, turning the control room into a sacrament of the execution. The lore of the Helghast heavy units, the massive shielded troopers, provides the lore of the unstoppable momentum of the fascism. These soldiers, encased in impervious plating and carrying rotary cannons, represent the ballistic sovereignty of the Helghan might. Their lore suggests that the individual has been replaced by the tank, representing the dehumanized sovereignty of the warfare. This is the lore of the walking wall. It suggests that pain is irrelevant to the will of the state. This represents the industrial sovereignty of the muscle. The lore of the heavy encounter is the lore of the irresistible force. You must find the gap in the steel to find the heart, proving that your sovereignty is analytical. This highlights the gritty nature of the combat, turning the fortress bridge into a sacrament of the grit. The lore of the ISA shadow network and the transmission of the treason introduces the lore of the informational sovereignty of the atoms. Throughout the fortress, the discovery of encrypted comms proves that General Adams has been feeding the ISA positions to the Helghast, representing the traitorous sovereignty of the High Command. The lore suggests that the front line was sold before the first shot was fired, representing the economic sovereignty of the betrayal. This is the lore of the mercenary general. It suggests that loyalty is a commodity. This represents the cynical sovereignty of the Vekta. The lore of the atom signal is the lore of the knife in the back. It nullifies the valor of the dead soldiers, proving that your sovereignty is the only record of the truth. For the Luger of the Mountain era, the world is the testing of the infiltration integrity. You realize that the world is being sealed in the iron. The lore suggests that Luger is the ghost in the machine. You are the only blade that cuts the wires before the trap is sprung. The mountain is not a peak. It is a mechanical spine of the war that you must snap with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the assassination of the guards so cold. You are becoming the shadow to bring the light. You look at the Helghast blueprints, knowing that they are the only maps that the history has left to redefine the Vekta. The Golden Age is a red on the general's head, and you are the only sight left to focus the rage of the Republic. As this fourth segment of the history concludes, the squad stands over the body of General Lente, the fortress shaking with the sound of the orbital bombardment. Behind lies the vertical sovereignty of the siege. Before stands the space station of the atoms and the final ascent into the stars. The air is no longer tense with the cold, but heavy with the smell of the burning electronics and the treason. You have seen the jetpack supremacy, the industrialized paranoia, and the violent conclusion of the command. The lore of Killzone has shifted from the sovereignty of the attrition to the sovereignty of the orbital truth. You realize that the traitor is above. You look at the stars, knowing that you are finally the only force of the gravity. The Golden Age is a rocket trail against the night, and you are the only hand left to pull the traitor from the sky. The breach of the orbital strategic defense, SD platforms, and the final ascent into the vacuum introduces the lore of the celestial sovereignty of the colonial shield. As the squad boards the massive space station, the environment transitions from terrestrial warfare to cosmic claustrophobia, representing the technological sovereignty of the High Command. The lore suggests that these platforms were designed to be the eyes and fists of the Vekta, but they have become a mechanical guillotine held over the planet's neck, representing the orbital sovereignty of the sabotage. For Templar, this mission is the lore of the assault on the heaven. He finds that the defense of the Republic is now being used to murder the Republic. This is the lore of the Steel Gallow, where the soldier must reclaim the sky to save the Earth, turning the docking bays into a sacrament of the vacuum. The duel with General Adams provides the lore of the treasonous hubris of the high rank. Adams, the man who sold Vekta to the Helghast, represents the moral decay of the ISA leadership. His lore is defined by the sovereignty of the pragmatic betrayal. He does not view himself as a traitor, but as a realist who saw the Helghast as the inevitable future, representing the cynical sovereignty of the collaboration. This is the lore of the general's cowardice. It suggests that power is a currency that Adams spent to buy his survival. This represents the bureaucratic sovereignty of the sin. The lore of the Adams' final stand is the lore of the shattered glass. He hides behind automated turrets and Helghast guards, proving that his sovereignty is artificial and dependent, turning the command bridge into a sacrament of the judgment. The activation of the strategic defense platforms provides the lore of the automated genocide of the Vekta. As the platforms are turned against the Helghast invasion fleet, it represents the mechanical sovereignty of the turning tide. The lore suggests that the laser does not distinguish between the soldier and the civilian, representing the indiscriminate sovereignty of the orbital strike. This is the lore of the light of the retribution. It suggests that salvation comes in the form of a beam that boils the atmosphere. This represents the pyrotechnic sovereignty of the defense. The lore of the SD activation is the lore of the scorched sky. You must input the codes to burn the invader, proving that your sovereignty is decisive. This highlights the terrifying scale of the solar warfare, turning the console interface into a sacrament of the purge. The lore of the Helghast leech infiltration pods provides the lore of the invasive sovereignty of the steel teeth. These pods, designed to bite into the hull of the station and vomit Helghast shock troops, represent the violent sovereignty of the boarding party. Their lore is defined by the sovereignty of the breach. It suggests that the Helghast are like a parasite that enters the brain of the ISA, representing the biological sovereignty of the machine. This is the lore of the inner nightmare. It suggests that metal is no protection against the will of the Visari. This represents the industrial sovereignty of the boarding. The lore of the leech encounter is the lore of the fight for the airlock. You must seal the holes to keep the vacuum out, proving that your sovereignty is containment. The presence of the Lente's ghost and the Helghast remnants introduces the lore of the fanaticism of the bereaved army. Despite the death of their general, the Helghast on the station fight with a suicidal intensity, representing the martyrdom sovereignty of the cult. The lore suggests that Visari has infected the mind deeper than Lente ever could, representing the spiritual sovereignty of the Helghan state. This is the lore of the unending grudge. It suggests that victory for the Helghast is not a strategy, but a religious necessity. This represents the psychological sovereignty of the goggles. The lore of the final wave is the lore of the blood on the steel. It forces the squad to exhaust their ammo on zombies of the ideology, proving that your sovereignty is the only sanity left in the orbit, turning the station corridors into a sacrament of the fanaticism. The lore of the Adams logic and the future of the Vekta provides the lore of the philosophical defeat of the colony. In his final moments, Adams warns that the ISA is just as bloody as the Helghast, representing the nihilistic sovereignty of the truth. The lore suggests that Earth does not care for Vekta, only for the resources, representing the imperial sovereignty of the UCN. This is the lore of the orphaned colony. It suggests that the war is just a dispute between two monsters. This represents the geopolitical sovereignty of the Centauri. The lore of the Adams death rattle is the lore of the warning of the traitor. It infects the victory with the shadow of the doubt, proving that your sovereignty is isolated. This highlights the grim reality of the Killzone, turning the ending of the station into a sacrament of the abandonment. For the Templar of the orbital era, the world is the testing of the strategic resolve. You realize that the world is being saved by a monster's weapon. The lore suggests that Jan is the captain of the falling star. You are the only mind that commands the laser to save the soil. The station is not a building, it is a mechanical eye of the storm that you must blink with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the killing of Adams so weightless. You are executing the treason in the zero gravity. You look at the Vekta below, knowing that it is the only beauty that the war has left to tarnish. The Golden Age is a flash of the SD beam, and you are the only hand left to signal the end of the Helghast landing. As this fifth segment of the history concludes, the squad stands on the observation deck, the Helghast fleet burning in the Vektan atmosphere. Behind lies the duel with the General Atoms. Before stands the destruction of the station and the escape to the surface. The air is no longer tense with the oxygen, but thin with the smell of the ozone and the metal. You have seen the assault on the heaven, the automated genocide, and the treasonous hubris of the rank. The lore of Killzone has shifted from the sovereignty of the orbital truth to the sovereignty of the burning sky. You realize that the war is not over. You look at the Helghan star in the distance, knowing that you are finally the first soldier of the retaliation. The Golden Age is a debris field in the dark, and you are the only life left to fall back to the Earth. The destruction of the SD platform and the plummet through the Vektan atmosphere introduces the lore of the incendiary rebirth of the colony. As the space station disintegrates under the weight of the Helghast sabotage and the ISA's own counterfire, the sky itself becomes a graveyard of shattered ambition, representing the orbital sovereignty of the ruin. The lore suggests that the shield of Vekta had to fall so the people of Vekta could finally see the face of the enemy without the filter of the technology. For Templar and his squad, this descent is the lore of the re-entry of the survivor. They are no longer colonial defenders, but scars of the conflict falling back to a world that has been purified by the fire. This is the lore of the falling star, where the soldier becomes the sacrament of the gravity, proving that the ISA's orbital dream was a mechanical hubris, turning the upper atmosphere into a casket of the Iron Peace. The landing on the reclaimed Vekta provides the lore of the ash-covered victory of the ISA. Touching down in the ruins of the capital, the squad finds a world that is free but broken, representing the bittersweet sovereignty of the reclamation. The lore suggests that winning is merely the right to bury the dead, representing the melancholic sovereignty of the victor. This is the lore of the silent liberation. It suggests that the Helghast did not just invade the land, they polluted the future. This represents the sociological sovereignty of the trauma. The lore of the reclaimed city is the lore of the static horizon. You look at the broken skyscrapers and realize they are tombstones of the old way, proving that your sovereignty is survivor's guilt, turning the city square into a sacrament of the mourning. The lore of the Helghast withdrawal and the orderly retreat provides the lore of the tactical patience of the autocracy. Even in defeat, the Helghast do not flee, they regroup with a terrifying discipline, representing the resilient sovereignty of the Helghan state. The lore suggests that the invasion of Vekta was never meant to be a permanent occupation, but a statement of the capability, representing the psychological sovereignty of the Visari. This is the lore of the wound that stays open. It suggests that the exile has tasted the blood and will return for the meal. This represents the strategic sovereignty of the hatred. The lore of the withdrawal is the lore of the looming shadow. It reminds the ISA that peace is just the reloading of the weapons, proving that your sovereignty is temporary. The prophetic warning of Scolar Visari provides the lore of the oratory infection of the solar system. Through the final broadcast intercepted by the ISA, the voice of the Helghan declares that the war has only just begun, representing the philosophical sovereignty of the fascism. His lore is defined by the sovereignty of the victimhood. He paints the ISA as the oppressors and the Helghast as the righteous sword of the outcast, representing the ideological sovereignty of the great leader. This is the lore of the master race narrative. It suggests that truth is whatever the strongest man says. This represents the totalitarian sovereignty of the rhetoric. The lore of the Visari speech is the lore of the spark of the Helghan War. It infects the future with the promise of the retaliation, turning the victory celebration into a sacrament of the dread. The presence of the Haka paradox and the future of the hybrid provides the lore of the genetic uncertainty of the peace. Haka, surviving the war, represents the bridge that no one wants to cross, representing the existential sovereignty of the half-breed. The lore suggests that Vekta will never trust to face that reminds them of the goggles, representing the paranoid sovereignty of the survivor. This is the lore of the internal exile. It suggests that the hybrid is the only one who truly sees the horror of both sides. This represents the intellectual sovereignty of the outcast. The lore of Haka's survival is the lore of the warning of the DNA. It proves that the war has changed the species, turning the post-war bureaucracy into a sacrament of the alienation, where the hero is a reminder of the enemy. The final assessment of the SAT Special Assault Team provides the lore of the fragmented unity of the Republic. As the four heroes go their separate ways, the lore reveals that the bond of the combat is the only thing that held the Vekta together, representing the fragile sovereignty of the Alliance. This is the lore of the disbanding of the Shield. It suggests that Chris, Rico, Luger, and Haka are four different versions of the pain, representing the psychological sovereignty of the warzone. The lore of the SAT legacy is the lore of the soldiers of the next war. It reminds the player that Killzone 1 was the birth of the heroes who would one day invade Helghan, proving that your sovereignty is cyclical. This highlights the tragic continuity of the series, turning the final scene into a sacrament of the prologue. For the Templar of the ending, the world is the testing of the narrative closure. You realize that the world is preparing for the next fire. The lore suggests that Jan is the keeper of the temporary peace. You are the only mind that sees the Helghan fleet in the dreams of the reclaimed Vekta. The victory is not a holiday, it is a ceasefire that you must uphold with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the filing of the report so hollow. You are saving a planet that is already planning the revenge. You look at the orange glow of the sunset, knowing that it looks too much like the eyes of the Helghast. The Golden Age is a silence of the artillery, and you are the only sound left to warn the world of the coming storm. As the sixth and final segment of the history concludes, the squad stands on the Vektan Ridge, the stars beginning to taint the twilight. Behind lies the destruction of the SD station. Before stands the invasion of Helghan and the infinite agony of the Killzone 2. The air is no longer tense with the smoke, but charged with the certainty of the retaliation. You have seen the atomic rebirth, the tactical patience of the state, and the prophetic warning of the Visari. The lore of Killzone has shifted from the sovereignty of the burning sky to the sovereignty of the eternal war. You realize that the Vekta is safe for now, but the Helghast are coming home. You look at the night sky, knowing that you are finally the first martyr of the interplanetary crusade. The Golden Age is a breath before the plunge, and you are the only light left to guide the ISA into the heart of the Helghan. The invasion of Helghan and the landing of the ISA fleet on the red dust surface introduces the lore of the solar reckoning of the colonial vengeance. 2 years after the defense of Vekta, the ISA has transitioned from victim to aggressor, launching a massive counterstrike to capture Scolar Visari and end the Helghast threat, representing the imperial sovereignty of the retaliation. The lore suggests that the Earth-backed ISA is no longer defending liberty, but exporting the violence to the source of the infection, representing the aggressive sovereignty of the UCN. For Sergeant Savchenko and Alpha Squad, the landing at Pyrrhus is the lore of the atmospheric hostility of the exile. They find that the air itself is a weapon filled with corrosive dust and static storms that turn the Vektan equipment into useless steel. This is the lore of the Red Purgatory, where the soldier becomes the sacrament of the environmental submission. The lore of the Pyrrhus city siege provides the lore of the urban fortress of the fanaticism. Pyrrhus, the capital of Helghan, is not built for living, but for defiance, representing the industrial sovereignty of the Scolar Visari. The lore suggests that every window is a sniper nest and every basement is a munitions factory, representing the totalitarian sovereignty of the architecture. This is the lore of the meat grinder of the ideology. It suggests that the Helghast have turned their trauma into a structural weapon. This represents the defensive sovereignty of the state. The lore of the Pyrrhus streets is the lore of the geometric death. You must clear the room to claim the dirt, proving that your sovereignty is tactical and exhausting. turning the industrial ruins into a sacrament of the attrition, where the hero is boiled by the red light. The introduction of the Petricite energy introduces the lore of the volatile sovereignty of the Helghan soil. Petricite, a highly unstable and glowing blue mineral found deep within the planet, serves as the lifeblood of the Helghast war machine, representing the resource sovereignty of the mutation. The lore suggests that Visari has weaponized the planet's core to compensate for the lack of the allies, representing the scientific sovereignty of the survival. This is the lore of the blue fire. It suggests that energy is violent and unpredictable. This represents the elemental sovereignty of the Helghan. The lore of the Petricite cells is the lore of the lightning in the bottle. It powers the arc towers to shatter the ISA tanks, proving that your sovereignty is biochemical. This highlights the electric nature of the conflict, turning the power plant raid into a sacrament of the electrocution. The lore of the Helghast arc towers provides the lore of the defensive lightning of the autocracy. These massive, obsidian-like spires act as a shield of the static, striking down any ISA aircraft that enters the city's airspace, representing the orbital sovereignty of the denial. The lore suggests that the Helghast do not need a fleet when they own the clouds, representing the atmospheric sovereignty of the Lente's successors. This is the lore of the thunder of the Visari. It suggests that entry is a death sentence written in the voltage. This represents the technological sovereignty of the defense. The lore of the arc tower sabotage is the lore of the grounding of the god. You must climb the spire to silence the storm, proving that your sovereignty is mechanical. This highlights the verticality of the siege, turning the upper walkways into a sacrament of the gravity. The presence of the Helghast Radic Academy provides the lore of the educational militarization of the hate. This facility, used to brainwash the conscripts into elites, represents the pedagogical sovereignty of the state. The lore suggests that the Helghast are made in the classroom before they are armed in the barracks, representing the psychological sovereignty of the indoctrination. This is the lore of the Temple of the War. It suggests that intellect is a tool of the slaughter. This represents the academic sovereignty of the Colonel Male Radic. The lore of the Academy breach is the lore of the desecration of the faith. You find the statues of the Visari and the books of the hatred, proving that your sovereignty is iconoclastic. This highlights the cult-like nature of the enemy, turning the Grand Hall combat into a sacrament of the profane. The lore of the Tharsis refinery provides the lore of the industrialized desperation of the colony. As the ISA pushes toward the source of the Helghast fuel, the lore reveals that the planet is being eaten to kill the invader, representing the suicidal sovereignty of the resource management. The lore suggests that Helghan is a suicide note written in the smoke and the oil, representing the economic sovereignty of the Visari. This is the lore of the burning horizon. It suggests that victory for the Helghast is worth the death of the world. This represents the nihilistic sovereignty of the industry. The lore of the refinery siege is the lore of the heart of the furnace. It chokes the Sev with the fumes of the ambition, proving that your sovereignty is respirational. This highlights the suffocating nature of the war, turning the catwalk firefights into a sacrament of the asphyxiation. For the Sev of the landing era, the world is the testing of the gritty resolve. You realize that the world is trying to kill you. The lore suggests that Sev is the logic in the red dust. You are the only mind that coordinates the Alpha to survive the siege. The city is not an objective. It is a mechanical trap that you must disarm with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the loading of the magazine so methodical. You are becoming the storm to stop the storm. You look at the lightning of the arc towers, knowing that it is the only light that the Visari has left to blind the justice. The Golden Age is a silence on the landing craft, and you are the only will left to lead the charge into the maw of the Helghan. As this first segment of the history concludes, Sev stands at the edge of the Pyrrhus district, the red dust swirling around his goggles. Behind lies the imperial sovereignty of the retaliation. Before stands the siege of the Academy and the arrival of the Colonel Radic. The air is no longer tense with the anticipation, but heavy with the smell of the ozone and the blood. You have seen the hostility of the exile, the volatile sovereignty of the petricite, and the defensive lightning of the state. The lore of Killzone 2 has shifted from the strategy of the invasion to the sovereignty of the survival. You realize that the invader is now the hunted. You look at the dark skyline, knowing that you are finally the first bullet in the heart of the Visari. The Golden Age is a blue spark in a red world, and you are the only hand left to shatter the crown of the Helghan. The sabotage of the Tharsis refinery and the extraction of the petricite core introduces the lore of the industrialized martyrdom of the Helghan energy. As Sev and Rico descend into the heart of the processing plant, the environment represents the volatile sovereignty of the resource extraction. The lore suggests that the refinery is not just a factory, but the circulatory system of the Helghast defense, pumping the blue petricite energy into the city's weapons, representing the metabolic sovereignty of the state. For Alpha Squad, this mission is the lore of the heart of the furnace. They find that the heat is a weaponized byproduct used to cook the invader in the narrow catwalks. This is the lore of the mechanical hell, where the soldier must boil the blood to silence the machines, turning the refinery catwalks into a sacrament of the evaporation. The tactical genius of Colonel Mail Radek provides the lore of the aristocratic coldness of the executioner. Radek, the leader of the Helghast Special Forces and the Visari's right hand, represents the lethal sovereignty of the military discipline. His lore is defined by the sovereignty of the professional slaughter. He does not shout propaganda. He delivers results with surgical precision, representing the cold sovereignty of the autocracy. This is the lore of the shadow of the general. It suggests that efficiency is the only virtue in the Helghan culture. This represents the elite sovereignty of the state. The lore of the Radek's ambush is the lore of the chessboard of the dead. He allows the ISA to advance only to cut their supply lines, proving that your sovereignty is reactive and vulnerable, turning the industrial zones into a sacrament of the masterclass strategy. The first true defeat of the ISA ground forces at the Soljiva village provides the lore of the crushing reality of the overextension. As the ISA armor divisions are liquidated by the Helghast heavy units and hidden at turrets, it represents the strategic sovereignty of the home turf advantage. The lore suggests that the ISA arrived with arrogance, believing that superior technology would shatter the Helghan will, only to find that will is the hardest armor, representing the psychological sovereignty of the resistance. This is the lore of the retreat of the sun. It suggests that conquest is a heavy weight that crushes the weak. This represents the totalitarian sovereignty of the defiance. The lore of the Soljiva massacre is the lore of the end of the momentum, turning the Vektan morale into a sacrament of the despair. The lore of the Helghast heavy shock troopers introduces the lore of the physical apex of the dehumanized war. These massive soldiers, encased in blast-proof ceramics and wielding petricite-driven chain guns, represent the ballistic sovereignty of the Helghan industry. Their lore suggests that the Helghan atmosphere has thickened their muscles, while the state has hardened their hearts, representing the biological sovereignty of the mutation. This is the lore of the walking fortress. It suggests that fear is a calculated variable. This represents the industrial sovereignty of the soldier. The lore of the heavy encounter is the lore of the wall of the lead. You must use the explosives to reach the man, proving that your sovereignty is destructive. This highlights the gritty nature of the combat, turning the Soljiva streets into a sacrament of the meat. The lore of the blood-freezing Helghan climate provides the lore of the atmospheric sovereignty of the exclusion zone. Throughout the wastes, the sub-zero dust storms and the static discharge represent the meteorological sovereignty of the Helghan. The lore suggests that the planet is rejecting the ISA like a biological virus, representing the ecological sovereignty of the exile. This is the lore of the red frost. It suggests that survival is not guaranteed by the gear. This represents the elemental sovereignty of the Visari. The lore of the storm navigation is the lore of the blind man's war. It forces the Sev to rely on the sound of the enemy's breathing, proving that your sovereignty is primitive. This highlights the suffocating nature of the planet, turning the wasteland trek into a sacrament of the sensory deprivation. The presence of the propaganda towers in the Saljiva wastes introduces the lore of the mental sovereignty of the invisible leader. Even in the remote mining villages, the voice of the Visari echoes from the loudspeakers, representing the ubiquitous sovereignty of the autarch. The lore suggests that Visari is omnipresent, a god of the red sky, who watches the sin of the invader, representing the spiritual sovereignty of the state. This is the lore of the eyes of the Helghan. It suggests that truth is what the speaker commands. This represents the sociological sovereignty of the control. The lore of the tower sabotage is the lore of the muting of the god. You must cut the power to stop the lies, proving that your sovereignty is intellectual, turning the mining outpost into a sacrament of the iconoclasm. For the Sev of the Saljiva era, the world is the testing of the tactical desperation. You realize that the world is winning the war. The lore suggests that Sev is the last bastion of the ISA morale. You are the only mind that sees the flaw in the Radix pattern. The village is not a place. It is a kill zone of the history that you must survive with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the saving of Rico so brutal. You are clinging to the squad while the army falls apart. You look at the red horizon, knowing that it is the only grave that the Visari has left to dig for the Vekta. The Golden Age is a misfire in the cold, and you are the only spark left to ignite the resistance against the Radix. As this second segment of the history concludes, Sev stands in the smoking ruins of the Saljiva bridge, the red dust clogging his rifle. Behind lies the heart of the furnace and the defeat of the ground forces. Before stands the infiltration of the male Radix cruiser and the final ascent to the palace. The air is no longer tense with the heat, but heavy with the smell of the ozone and the metal. You have seen the tactical genius of the executioner, the walking fortress of the state, and the mental sovereignty of the leader. The lore of Killzone 2 has shifted from the sovereignty of the survival to the sovereignty of the counterattack. You realize that the invader must become the assassin. You look at the sky, knowing that you are finally the only bullet left in the chamber. The Golden Age is a shattered shield, and you are the only sword left to pierce the heart of the Pyrrhus. The infiltration of the Helghast cruiser and the assault on the aerial command fleet introduces the lore of the vertical sovereignty of the Helghan skies. As Sev and Rico board the massive Gothic warships, the environment represents the obsidian sovereignty of the air superiority. The lore suggests that these cruisers are not just transports, but flying cathedrals of the war, designed to project the will of Visari over any planetary surface, representing the orbital sovereignty of the state. For Alpha Squad, this mission is the lore of the belly of the beast. They find that the internal security is a clockwork of the execution, where the narrow corridors are designed to funnel the invader into the crossfire of the sentry turrets. This is the lore of the pressurized purgatory, where the soldier must choke the engine to shatter the wing, turning the cruiser hangar into a sacrament of the decompression. The duel in the hangar provides the lore of the brutal sincerity of the Helghast infantry. As the squad is forced to fight through the elite guard to reach the bridge, it represents the sovereignty of the martial prowess. The lore suggests that the cruiser crew are selected for their fanaticism, representing the psychological sovereignty of the male Radix. This is the lore of the zero-gravity butcher. It suggests that loyalty is tested in the fire. This represents the totalitarian sovereignty of the fleet. The lore of the hangar combat is the lore of the kinetic desperation. You must use the environment to crush the armor, proving that your sovereignty is adaptive. This highlights the high-stakes nature of the boarding, turning the flight deck into a sacrament of the metal, where the hero is measured by the scars. The discovery of the final secrets of the Petrosite weaponry provides the lore of the radioactive sovereignty of the Helghan science. Deep within the cruiser's armory, the lore reveals the Petrosite grenades and arc rifles, representing the molecular sovereignty of the mutation. The lore suggests that Visari has stolen the lightning to punish the Vekta, representing the technological sovereignty of the Revenge. This is the lore of the synthetic apocalypse. It suggests that energy is the final frontier of the hate. This represents the elemental sovereignty of the lab. The lore of the Petricite weaponry is the lore of the Blue Death. It dissolves the flesh and shatters the steel, proving that your sovereignty is scientific. This highlights the unnatural nature of the conflict, turning the armory raid into a sacrament of the radiation. The lore of the Helghast commando units introduces the lore of the guerrilla sovereignty of the elite outcast. These specialized troops, equipped with cloaking technology and silent suppressors, represent the invasive sovereignty of the shadow. Their lore suggests that the Helghast have learned to hide in the smoke, to bite the throat of the ISA, representing the predatory sovereignty of the Radic Academy. This is the lore of the Phantom of the Helghan. It suggests that visibility is a choice of the predator. This represents the tactical sovereignty of the assassination. The lore of the commando encounter is the lore of the sound of the blade. You must watch the static to find the man, proving that your sovereignty is perceptive. This highlights the paranoid nature of the combat, turning the service tunnels into a sacrament of the stealth. The presence of the Visari's final intercom introduces the lore of the omnipresent sovereignty of the autarch. Throughout the cruiser, the voice of the leader continues to command the dead, representing the vocal sovereignty of the indoctrination. The lore suggests that Visari does not lead an army. He controls a mind, representing the spiritual sovereignty of the state. This is the lore of the ghost in the circuit. It suggests that death is irrelevant to the cause. This represents the sociological sovereignty of the control. The lore of the intercom broadcast is the lore of the infinite echo. It infects the silence with the promise of the resurrection, proving that your sovereignty is intellectual, turning the bridge assault into a sacrament of the fanaticism, where the enemy is fighting for a god. The lore of the Suljiva mining heritage provides the lore of the economic sovereignty of the slave labor. As the squad finds the logs of the Petricite extraction, the lore reveals that the Helghan people were worked to the bone to build the fleet, representing the industrial sovereignty of the sacrifice. The lore suggests that the cruiser is built of the Helghast souls, representing the bureaucratic sovereignty of the Visari. This is the lore of the monument to the pain. It suggests that greatness is paid for in the blood of the weak. This represents the nihilistic sovereignty of the industry. The lore of the mining records is the lore of the cost of the war. It sours the victory with the reality of the slavery, proving that your sovereignty is tragic. This highlights the dark reality of the planet, turning the data retrieval into a sacrament of the guilt. For the Sev of the cruiser era, the world is the testing of the claustrophobic resolve. You realize that the world is being controlled from the sky. The lore suggests that Sev is the virus in the system. You are the only mind that understands the architecture of the failure. The cruiser is not a ship. It is a mechanical heart of the tyranny that you must stop with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the setting of the explosives so quiet. You are killing the machine to reach the man. You look at the Helghast crest on the wall, knowing that it is the only mark that the Visari has left to tattoo the sky. The golden age is a hum of the reactor, and you are the only note left to signal the end of the aerial occupation. As this third segment of the history concludes, Sev stands on the observation deck of the crashing cruiser, the Pyrrhus city rushing up to meet the steel. Behind lies the infiltration of the fleet and the secrets of the Petricite. Before stands the siege of the Visari palace and the final duel with male Radic. The air is no longer tense with the vacuum, but heavy with the smell of the ozone and the imminent impact. You have seen the sovereignty of the air superiority, the molecular sovereignty of the mutation, and the vocal sovereignty of the leader. The lore of Killzone 2 has shifted from the sovereignty of the counterattack to the sovereignty of the endgame. You realize that the god is naked. You look at the palace spire, knowing that you are finally the only storm left to break. The golden age is a burning wing in the dark, and you are the only will left to walk into the heart of the fire. The breach of the Visari palace perimeter and the final storming of the Autarchus seat introduces the lore of the architectural sovereignty of the Helghast ego. As Sev and the remnants of the ISA forces reach the Grand Plaza, the environment represents the totalitarian sovereignty of the monumentalism. The lore suggests that the palace is not just a home, but a statement of the Helghan superiority, built with sharp, aggressive angles and massive obsidian-like slabs that dwarf the human form, representing the psychological sovereignty of the state. For Alpha Squad, this mission is the lore of the desecration of the temple. They find that the palace guard are the most fanatic soldiers in the history of the war, men who have sworn their blood to the Visari, representing the spiritual sovereignty of the oath. This is the lore of the Last Stand, where the soldier must trample the pride to end the nightmare, turning the palace courtyard into a sacrament of the ruin. The fall of the Helghast Guard provides the lore of the systematic liquidation of the elite. These troops, equipped with the best petricite shields and heavy weaponry the Helghan industry can provide, represent the industrial sovereignty of the bodyguard. The lore suggests that the guard is a human wall designed to buy Visari the time to speak, representing the bureaucratic sovereignty of the sacrifice. This is the lore of the dying vanguard. It suggests that loyalty is a resource that is spent until the vault is empty. This represents the totalitarian sovereignty of the command. The lore of the plaza combat is the lore of the meat grinder of the history. You must walk over the fallen to reach the door, proving that your sovereignty is relentless. This highlights the high-stakes nature of the breach, turning the staircases of the palace into a sacrament of the attrition. The final duel with Colonel Male Radek provides the lore of the aristocratic death of the perfectionist. Radek, choosing to fight the ISA in the grand balcony of the palace, represents the martial sovereignty of the Helghan aristocracy. His lore is defined by the sovereignty of the honorable executioner. He does not hide. He teleports and assaults with an unflinching precision, representing the elite sovereignty of the academy. This is the lore of the warrior's end. It suggests that Radek is the final obstacle between the civilization and the autarch. This represents the tactical sovereignty of the duel. The lore of the Radek confrontation is the lore of the suicide of the pride. By taking his own life rather than surrendering to the ISA, Radek proves that his sovereignty is absolute and unbreakable, turning the palace balcony into a sacrament of the defiance. The lore of the Petricite Pulse defenses provides the lore of the molecular sovereignty of the palace security. Throughout the halls, the deployment of arc turrets and electrified barriers represents the energy sovereignty of the Helghast science. The lore suggests that the palace is alive with the lightning of the Helghan soil, representing the environmental sovereignty of the defense. This is the lore of the living fortress. It suggests that steel is infused with the hate. This represents the technological sovereignty of the Visari. The lore of the interior sabotage is the lore of the grounding of the power. You must shatter the crystals to open the path, proving that your sovereignty is mechanical and destructive. This highlights the electric nature of the conflict, turning the grand hallways into a sacrament of the static. The lore of the Helghast capture and the fate of the ISA generals provides the lore of the political sovereignty of the Helghan leverage. As the squad finds the interrogation chambers within the palace, the lore reveals that the ISA High Command was paralyzed by the Helghast counterintelligence, representing the cynical sovereignty of the Atom's legacy. The lore suggests that the General Templar was betrayed by the Vektan bureaucracy, representing the institutional sovereignty of the corruption. This is the lore of the betrayed hero. It suggests that war is lost in the office before it is won in the field. This represents the strategic sovereignty of the state. The lore of the palace records is the lore of the end of the Republic. It sours the advance with the reality of the treason, proving that your sovereignty is isolated. The presence of the Visari's inner sanctum introduces the lore of the theological sovereignty of the dictator. As Sev and Rico approach the final doors, the architecture becomes religious in its intensity, representing the spiritual sovereignty of the autarch. The lore suggests that Visari has turned himself into a god to give the Helghast a reason to die, representing the sociological sovereignty of the state. This is the lore of the temple of the ego. It suggests that personality is the only law in the Helghan world. This represents the autocratic sovereignty of the Visari. The lore of the inner sanctum is the lore of the silence of the god. It prepares the Sev for the final conversation, proving that your sovereignty is final, turning the final doors into a sacrament of the truth, where the monster is waiting to speak. For the Sev of the Palace era, the world is the testing of the morale integrity. You realize that the world is defined by the one man. The lore suggests that Sev is the end of the Helghast era. You are the only bullet that targets the heart of the lie. The palace is not a building, it is a mechanical spine of the terror that you must snap with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the killing of Radek so cold. You are removing the shield to expose the sword. You look at the Helghast banners, knowing that they are the only veils that the Visari has left to hide the truth. The Golden Age is a silence in the Grand Hall, and you are the only echo left to signal the end of the Radek's pride. As this fourth segment of the history concludes, Sev stands before the great doors of the Autarch, the blood of the Radek on the floor. Behind lies the fall of the Helghast guard and the duel on the balcony. Before stands the final meeting with Scolar Visari and the beginning of the Helghan Holocaust. The air is no longer tense with the battle, but heavy with the smell of the ozone and the prophecy. You have seen the architectural sovereignty of the ego, the suicide of the pride, and the theological sovereignty of the state. The lore of Killzone 2 has shifted from the sovereignty of the endgame to the sovereignty of the consequence. You realize that the god is waiting. You look at the door, knowing that you are finally the only executioner of the history. The Golden Age is a red light under the door, and you are the only will left to shatter the voice of the Helghan. The final conversation with Scolar Visari and the breach of the inner sanctum introduces the lore of the philosophical sovereignty of the Autarch's will. As Sev and Rico confront Visari, the environment is stripped of military utility and replaced with imperial grandeur, representing the intellectual sovereignty of the state. The lore suggests that Visari is not a soldier, but a creator of a reality who has transformed the Helghast into a weapon through words alone, representing the linguistic sovereignty of the dictatorship. For Sev, this encounter is the lore of the trap of the narrative. He finds that Visari does not plead for his life. Instead, he orchestrates his own martyrdom to ensure the eternal hatred of his people against the ISA. This is the lore of the political suicide, where the monster becomes the sacrament of the unending war. The execution of the Autarch by Rico Velasquez provides the lore of the emotional volatility of the ISA failure. Driven by the grief of his fallen squad and the taunts of the dictator, Rico's decision to gun down Visari represents the impulsive sovereignty of the human rage. The lore suggests that Visari won the moment the trigger was pulled, as he died a hero of the Helghan rather than a prisoner of the Vekta, representing the martyrdom sovereignty of the Visari. This is the lore of the death of the law. It suggests that order cannot survive the chaos of the revenge. This represents the moral sovereignty of the defeat. The lore of the Visari's death is the lore of the birth of the ghost, turning the palace throne room into a sacrament of the eternal conflict, where the victory is nothing but a grave. The post-nuclear destruction of Pyrrhus and the nuclear detonation provides the lore of the scorched earth sovereignty of the Helghan. As the red dust of the city is consumed by the white light of the Helghast-triggered nuclear device, it represents the apocalyptic sovereignty of the exclusion. The lore suggests that the Helghast would rather erase their own capital than surrender its keys to the invader, representing the genocidal sovereignty of the state. This is the lore of the atomic cleansing. It suggests that fire is the only way to purify the soil of the ISA presence. This represents the nihilistic sovereignty of the survival. The lore of the nuclear flash is the lore of the end of the Pyrrhus, turning the colonial ambition into a sacrament of the ash. The lore of the Vektan guilt and the failure of the mission provides the lore of the strategic collapse of the ISA invasion. With the fleet destroyed and the Autarch dead but ascended, the ISA forces are left stranded on a radioactive rock, representing the isolated sovereignty of the marooned. The lore suggests that the invasion was a sunk cost fallacy that led to the destruction of a generation, representing the imperial sovereignty of the hubris. This is the lore of the orphaned army. It suggests that Earth has abandoned the Vekta to the mercy of the Helghan winter. This represents the cynical sovereignty of the High Command. The lore of the failed extraction is the lore of the long walk home, proving that your sovereignty is meaningless in the presence of the void. The presence of the stall arms and the rise of the new leaders introduces the lore of the corporate sovereignty of the post-Visari era. As the power vacuum opens, the lore reveals the shadow players like Joran Stahl, who represent the technological sovereignty of the arms race. The lore suggests that Visari was the face, but Stahl is the engine that will rebuild the hate, representing the economic sovereignty of the Helghan. This is the lore of the rebirth of the industry. It suggests that ideology is powered by the prophets. This represents the mercenary sovereignty of the state. The lore of the Stahl rise is the lore of the endless cycle. It infects the future with the promise of a better weapon, proving that your sovereignty is tactical but not structural. The lore of the Sev's thousand-yard stare provides the lore of the psychological dissolution of the hero. Sitting on the palace steps as the sky falls, Sev's silence represents the catatonic sovereignty of the disillusionment. The lore suggests that the soldier has seen the end of the world and realized that he helped to light the match, representing the moral sovereignty of the accountability. This is the lore of the shell-shocked savior. It suggests that sanity is the first casualty of the Helghan soil. This represents the humanistic sovereignty of the trauma. The lore of the final scene is the lore of the silence of the god. It removes the hope from the victory, turning the credits into a sacrament of the despair, where the protagonist is lost in the red. For the Sev of the final part, the world is the testing of the nihilistic resolve. You realize that the world is dead because of you. The lore suggests that Sev is the witness to the apocalypse. You are the only mind that understands that the Visari won the war. The palace is not a building, it is a mechanical tombstone for the humanity that you must accept with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the looking at the horizon so heavy. You are watching the sun go out. You look at the Rico, knowing that his rage has signed the death warrant for the rest of the fleet. The Golden Age is a mushroom cloud over the Pyrrhus, and you are the only will left to sit in the ash and wait for the end. As this fifth and final segment of the history concludes, Sev sits on the steps of the burning palace, the Helghast fleet beginning to scream across the sky. Behind lies the execution of the autarch. Before stands the guerrilla war of Killzone 3 and the infinite struggle for the survival. The air is no longer tense with the battle, but cold with the certainty of the doom. You have seen the philosophical sovereignty of the will, the impulsive sovereignty of the rage, and the post-nuclear destruction of the state. The lore of Killzone 2 has shifted from the sovereignty of the endgame to the sovereignty of the void. You realize that the god is dead, but the religion is stronger than ever. You look at the ash falling like snow, knowing that you are finally the last soldier of a forgotten cause. The Golden Age is a flash in the dark, and you are the only eye left to watch the Helghan Empire burn. The lore of Killzone 3 begins in the immediate, suffocating aftermath of the invasion of Helghan. The story picks up mere seconds after the conclusion of the second game, centering on the sovereignty of the power vacuum. With the death of the autarch, Scolar Visari, at the hands of Rico Velasquez, the Helghast people are left without a voice, but not without a bite. This represents the lore of the martyr's wrath. Visari's death did not break the Helghast spirit. It galvanized it into a fanatical, directionless rage. The environment of the capital city, Pyrrhus, is a nightmare of nuclear winter, a radioactive wasteland created by Visari's own red dust detonation. The primary objective for the ISA Interplanetary Strategic Alliance is no longer victory, but the sovereignty of the desperate retreat. The invasion has failed. The ISA fleet is shattered, and the ground forces are scattered across a dying city. This introduces the lore of the abandoned soldier. Characters Savchenko and Rico must navigate the ruins of Pyrrhus, which is now a sovereignty of the toxic rubble. The environment is a jagged landscape of twisted rebar, gray ash, and the emerald-green glow of irradiated petricite. This represents the lore of the post-apocalyptic urban warfare, where every corner holds a Helghast sniper who views the ISA not as occupiers, but as the murderers of their father. Inside the Helghast High Command, a different war is brewing, the sovereignty of the political vulture. With Visari gone, two titans vie for the throne. First is Admiral Orlok, the commander of the Helghast military. He represents the lore of the Iron Fist, believing in raw, overwhelming martial power. Opposing him is Jordan Stahl, the CEO of Stahl Arms. Stahl represents the sovereignty of the industrial overlord. He is the man who built the Helghast war machine, and he views the military as an inefficient tool. This conflict introduces the lore of the Civil Cold War, where the Helghast are as much a threat to each other as they are to the ISA. The environment of the Stahl Arms research facility provides a stark contrast to the ruins of the city. This is the sovereignty of the clinical terror. It is a world of polished white floors, blue energy conduits, and the irradiated petricite weapons that Stahl is perfecting. This represents the lore of the technological escalation. Stahl is developing a weapon capable of cascading organic matter, literally vaporizing human beings from the inside out. This turns the environment into a sovereignty of the invisible death. Sev, must witness the horrifying efficiency of these weapons as they are tested on ISA prisoners of war. The lore of the Helghast sniper is refined in this chapter. In the gray ruins of Pyrrhus, the iconic glowing red eyes are the only warning a Marine gets. This represents the sovereignty of the Predator's mark. The Helghast are masters of their environment. They don't need heat seekers because they know every vent and sewer line in the city. The environment is a sovereignty of the vertical ambush, where ISA squads are picked apart by marksmen using the VC-32 sniper rifle. Sev has to rely on his sovereignty of the tactical awareness, using smoke and suppressive fire just to move across a single city block. As the ISA attempts to reach the extraction point, they realize the lore of the final departure. The ISA cruisers remaining in orbit are being picked off by Stahl's new orbital defense spires. This represents the sovereignty of the blockade. The ISA is trapped on a planet that is literally poisoning them. The environment of the evacuation zone is a chaotic mess of burning dropships and screaming wounded. This represents the lore of the failed promise, where the High Command on Vekta has essentially written off the remaining soldiers as acceptable losses. Sev and Rico are left to wonder if they are fighting for a cause or just for the next 5 minutes of breath. The air on Helghan is a character in itself. It is heavy air, filled with the particulate of industrial waste and the ozone of petricite weapons. This is the sovereignty of the respiratory struggle. Every soldier wears a mask not just for identity but for survival. This represents the lore of the masked society. The Helghast look like monsters because they have adapted to a monstrous world. The environment of the ash tracks outside the city shows the true scale of the planet, a world that was never meant to sustain life, yet produced the most resilient warriors in the galaxy. As the part ends, Savchenko looks back at the mushroom cloud still hanging over Pyrrhus. The lore of the lost cause is heavy on his mind. The golden age of the ISA invasion is a contract written in nuclear ash, and Sev is the only witness left to sign the exit. He boards a ragged transport, but a Stahl Arms stalker walker appears through the fog, its red eyes burning with a promise of total annihilation. The retreat has just become a fight for the soul of the ISA. The sound of the Helghast war horns echoes through the canyons of steel. The lore of the Helghan counterstrike has begun. Sev readies his rifle, the green glow of the irradiated city reflecting in his eyes. The ISA survivors are forced away from the industrial ruins and into the Helghan jungle, a biome that defies every law of Terran biology. The lore here centers on the sovereignty of the alien ecosystem. This isn't a natural forest. It is a petricite-infused nightmare where the flora is as lethal as the fauna. This represents the lore of the living trap. The environment is dominated by burrowing vines and spore-generating fungi that glow with a sickening green light. This is the sovereignty of the poisonous green, where the very air can cause respiratory failure if a soldier's mask seal is compromised. Sev and Rico must navigate this vertical labyrinth while being stalked by enemies who have integrated themselves into the predatory cycle of the woods. The primary tactical threat in the jungle is the Helghast capture trooper. This introduces the lore of the CQC specialist. These units are the elite of the Helghast infantry, equipped with invisibility cloaks and dual-mounted wrist blades. This represents the sovereignty of the silent executioner. Unlike the standard grunts, capture troopers do not use firearms. They rely on speed and the lore of the terror takedown. The environment provides them with perfect concealment among the shifting, glowing vines. Sev has to rely on his sovereignty of the primal reflex, listening for the slight shimmer of displaced air or the snap of a twig. This turns the mission into a high-stakes game of hide-and-seek where the loser is gutted in the dark. To combat the density of the jungle and the armored threats lurking within, Sev discovers the Wasp rocket launcher. This introduces the lore of the swarm ordnance. The Wasp is the sovereignty of the portable artillery, capable of firing a curtain of micromissiles that saturate an entire area. This represents the lore of the scorched earth policy. In the cramped, foliage-heavy environment, precision is impossible, so the ISA relies on overwhelming fire volume. The lore of the Emerald Fire describes the result: the green jungle turning into a black, charred crater in seconds. Sev uses the Wasp to clear spider mine nests and to bring down the massive Helghast heavy tanks that attempt to push through the undergrowth. The environment of the jungle floor is a graveyard of petricite spires. These jagged crystals pulse with raw energy, serving as the batteries for the planet. This is the sovereignty of the geological battery. The lore suggests that the jungle's hyperaggression is fueled by this radiation. This represents the lore of the irradiated evolution. Sev can use these spires as environmental weapons. A well-placed bullet can cause a spire to detonate, releasing a petricite shockwave that disintegrates anything nearby. This is the tactical sovereignty of the resourceful soldier, turning the planet's own lifeblood against the Helghast occupiers. Inside the jungle's heart lies the Helghast Research Outpost Gamma. This is the sovereignty of the botanical laboratory. Here, Stahl scientists are harvesting the jungle's toxins to create new chemical weapons. This represents the lore of the weaponized nature. Sev finds stasis pods containing captured ISA soldiers being exposed to alien spores to test their lethality. This adds a layer of moral sovereignty to the mission. The ISA isn't just trying to escape, they are trying to stop a biological atrocity. The environment is a jarring mix of high-tech glass observation decks and raw, oozing organic matter. Sev's objective shifts to ecological sabotage, overloading the outpost's cooling systems to let the jungle reclaim the facility. As the ISA reaches the edge of the jungle, they encounter the lore of the Helghast Beastmasters. These specialized units use sonic prods to drive packs of native Helghan mawbirds toward the ISA lines. This represents the sovereignty of the biological proxy. The environment is filled with the screeching of avian predators and the barking of Helghast handlers. This is the lore of the primal war, where the line between soldier and animal is blurred. Sev must use the M224A1 light machine gun to hold back the tide of feathers and teeth. The golden age of the ISA's mission is now a struggle in the Emerald Gut, and Sev is the only knife left to cut a path out. The air begins to thin as the jungle gives way to the frozen shores. Sev looks back at the glowing green canopy, his suit covered in alien spores and Helghast blood. The lore of the green grave is behind them, but the ice ahead is even more unforgiving. The Golden Age is a world of teeth and thorns, and the sovereignty of the survivor is all that matters. Sev checks his Wasp launcher, the last of the missiles locked and loaded. The ISA survivors emerge from the emerald suffocations of the jungle only to be met by the frozen shores, a brutal coastline where the planet's erratic climate creates massive glaciers of ice and salt. The lore here transitions to the sovereignty of the sub-zero desert. This environment is a jagged wasteland of whiteout blizzards and towering ice shelves that groan under their own weight. This represents the lore of the absolute zero, where the primary enemy is the cold itself. The ISA's standard issue armor is not rated for these temperatures, forcing Sev and Rico to move between heat vents and abandoned Helghast thermal shelters to avoid freezing. This is the sovereignty of the shivering soldier, where survival is measured in the minutes remaining in a thermal battery. The primary technological threat on the ice is the Helghast ice saw. This introduces the lore of the industrial ravager. These are massive, treaded vehicles equipped with forward-mounted circular saws designed to cut through glaciers and ISA squads. This represents the sovereignty of the mechanical terror. The environment of the salt flats allows these vehicles to reach terrifying speeds, turning the battlefield into a high-velocity slaughter. The lore of the Blizzard Charge describes how the Helghast use the limited visibility to strike and disappear. Sev must use the VC-11 bolt gun, a weapon that fires explosive projectiles, to puncture the saw's fuel lines. This is the sovereignty of the kinetic impact, where a single well-placed bolt can turn an industrial giant into a frozen fireball. Dominating the horizon is the Helghast Mobile Factory, a gargantuan walking fortress the size of a city block. This is the sovereignty of the Steel Colossus. The factory moves on 6 massive hydraulic legs, processing the planet's ice into liquid petricite fuel as it travels. This represents the lore of the moving hegemony. The environment inside the factory is a jarring contrast to the ice outside. It is a world of molten metal, roaring furnaces, and the deafening clank of heavy machinery. This is the sovereignty of the industrial heart. Sev's mission is to board this beast and sabotage its primary intake valves. The lore of the Stairway to Hell describes the vertical climb up the factory's legs while under fire from Wasp turrets. The Helghast jetpack troopers make their debut in this sector. This introduces the lore of the vertical superiority. These elite units use petricite-powered flight to bypass the treacherous ice entirely, raining down fire from above. This represents the sovereignty of the aerial predator. The environment of the factory catwalks becomes a 360-degree combat zone. Sev is forced to hijack a Helghast jetpack to pursue them, leading to the lore of the dogfight in the smog. This represents the sovereignty of the sky-high risk. Fighting while airborne requires a level of coordination the ISA Marines weren't trained for, turning the battle into a desperate struggle for balance and altitude over the churning gears of the factory. Inside the factory's refining core, Sev discovers the lore of the Stahl-Orlok rift. He intercepts a transmission between Admiral Orlok and Jordan Stahl. Orlok wants the factory to produce fuel for the Home Guard, while Stahl is diverting resources to his private Stahl Arms fleet. This is the sovereignty of the fractured command. The lore of the corporate coup reveals that Stahl is planning to supersede the military entirely. The environment around the core is a sovereignty of the unstable energy, where blue petricite gas leaks from the pipes. Sev realizes that the Helghast are so busy fighting for the crown that they have left their neck exposed. This solidifies his sovereignty of the saboteur as he targets the factory's pressure regulators. The environment of the factory's cargo bay is a forest of steel, filled with thousands of MAW-12 rocket launchers being prepared for shipment to the front lines. This is the lore of the endless arsenal. Sev uses these weapons to hold back the security droids, small, hovering machines equipped with stun prods. This represents the sovereignty of the automated sentry. The lore of the factory floor stand describes the chaos of a million-ton machine tearing itself apart from the inside. This is the sovereignty of the mechanical suicide. As the factory begins to tilt, the environment becomes a slope of death, with heavy shipping crates sliding across the floor like high-speed projectiles. The climax of the Frozen Shores occurs as the mobile factory collapses into the sea. This is the sovereignty of the oceanic grave. The lore of the icebreak describes the massive tidal wave created by the factory's fall, which shatters the surrounding glaciers for miles. This represents the sovereignty of the environmental shockwave. Sev and Rico must leap from the falling deck onto a departing ISA intruder dropship. This is the lore of the leap of faith. Looking down, they see the gargantuan machine sinking into the black, freezing water, its green petricite lights flickering out one by one. The Golden Age is a world of sinking iron, and Sev is the only anchor left to cut the rope. The air in the dropship is freezing, the breath of the Marines visible in the dim red light. Sev looks at the data drive he stole from the factory's bridge. The lore of the Stahl's plan is finally in his hands. He realizes that the war on Helghan was just a distraction for something much larger. The Golden Age is a contract signed in liquid ice, and the sovereignty of the truth is the only thing that can save the ISA fleet. Sev checks his rifle, the cold metal sticking to his gloves. The shores are behind them, but the Stahl Arms Research Complex lies ahead in the jungle of steel. As the part ends, the dropship banks toward the north, away from the ice and toward the glowing towers of the Helghast industrial heartland. The lore of the final stronghold is the final destination. The sound of the wind howling outside the hull is the sovereignty of the void, a reminder that on Helghan, nowhere is safe. The ISA survivors penetrate the inner perimeter of the Stahl Arms space elevator, a vertical megalith that serves as the umbilical cord between Helghan's surface and its orbital shipyards. The lore here centers on the sovereignty of the atmospheric piercing. This is the peak of Helghast engineering, a structure so tall that its upper reaches are anchored in the vacuum of space. The environment is a dizzying mix of high-speed maglev tracks and external maintenance scaffolds that vibrate with the hum of high-output petricite. This represents the lore of the industrial ascent. As Sev and Rico climb, the ground below disappears into the permanent gray smog of the planet, replaced by the sovereignty of the thin air, where the wind howls with enough force to pull a soldier off the railings. The primary tactical threat within the elevator complex is the Helghast infiltrator. This introduces the lore of the Mimic Soldier. These are Stahl's elite security units, equipped with advanced active camouflage that bends light around their armor. This represents the sovereignty of the unseen blade. Unlike the capture troopers of the jungle, infiltrators are trained for urban ghosting, hiding in plain sight against the brushed steel and glass of the facility. The lore of the static hunter describes the psychological toll this takes on the ISA. Sev must watch for the slight shimmer of refractive distortion against the facility's neon lights. One wrong step leads to a stun-batten execution, a silent end in a world of humming machines. Turok, wait, Sev discovers the lore of the Stahl Arms prototype. In the testing bays of the lower elevator, he finds the VC-5 electricity gun. This introduces the sovereignty of the arcing death. The weapon fires a continuous stream of high-voltage lightning that jumps between targets, bypassing Helghast armor and frying their internal electronics. This represents the lore of the energy monopoly. In the tight, metal-heavy corridors of the space elevator, the VC-5 is the sovereignty of the bottleneck, capable of clearing entire hallways with a single trigger pull. However, the weapon is volatile. The environment is filled with power couplers that can explode if struck by the arc, turning the room into a lethal cage of electricity. The environment of the Ascension pods provides a unique sovereignty of the moving battlefield. These pods are the size of houses, moving at hundreds of miles per hour up the elevator's tether. This is the lore of the high-velocity siege. The ISA must fight their way from pod to pod using grav hooks, while being harassed by Helghast overlord gunships. This represents the sovereignty of the vertical dogfight. The lore of the Tether War describes the terror of fighting on the exterior of a moving vessel where gravity is the most consistent killer. Sev uses the M82G assault rifle to pick off scout snipers on adjacent pods, the green tracer fire streaking through the thinning atmosphere like falling stars. Inside the command hub, located halfway up the tether, Sev discovers the lore of the green fire. He finds the blueprints for Stahl's secret project, the orbital petricite cannon. This represents the sovereignty of the extinction event. The weapon doesn't fire traditional explosives. It fires a beam of irradiated petricite that triggers a molecular decay in its targets. This is the lore of the atomic erasure. The environment around the hub is filled with sample canisters of this weaponized gas, which glows with a haunting, neon green brilliance. Sev realizes that Stahl isn't just trying to win the war. He's trying to replace the Helghast military with a weapon that makes soldiers obsolete. This solidifies the sovereignty of the saboteur's burden. The environment of the external scaffolding is a cathedral of ribbed steel. This is the sovereignty of the high-altitude hazard. Here, the oxygen levels are so low that the ISA must rely on emergency rebreathers. This represents the lure of the suffocating height. The lure of the oxygen rush describes the frantic combat where every bullet hole in a soldier's suit is a death sentence. Sev encounters the Helghast Sentinels, autonomous drones that use sonic scanning to find targets through the thick clouds. This is the sovereignty of the automated hunt. The environment is a chaotic soundscape of metal groaning under atmospheric pressure and the constant chirp-chirp of drone sensors. The climax of the space elevator infiltration occurs at the airlock terminal. As Sev prepares to board the final pod to the orbital station, he is intercepted by Stahl's personal bodyguards. These units wear petrocite-infused power armor, representing the sovereignty of the Juggernaut. They are immune to small arms fire and can move with surprising speed due to servo assist. This is the lore of the unstoppable wall. Sev must use the sovereignty of the environmental hazard, shooting the hydraulic seals of the airlock to depressurize the room. The resulting explosive decompression sucks the armored guards into the void, while Sev anchors himself using his combat knife. The air in the final pod is thin and tastes of copper. Sev looks down at the planet Helghan, which is now just a swirling marble of gray and green far below. The lore of the view from the heavens is a moment of cold clarity. The Golden Age is a world of dust under a glass ceiling, and Sev is the only shatter left to break the surface. He watches the stars become visible as the pod nears the orbital station. The Golden Age is a contract signed in the vacuum, and the sovereignty of the final breath is all he has left. He checks his remaining grenades, his hands shaking from the lack of pressure. As the part ends, the pod docks with the Stahl Arms orbital array. The mechanical docking clamps sound like the closing jaws of a trap. The lore of the Stahl Sanctum is the final destination. The sound of the vacuum hissing through the seals is the sovereignty of the end, a reminder that in space, nobody can hear the ISA scream. The ISA survivors exit the docking pod and step into the Stahl Arms orbital array, a sterile, sprawling station that hangs like a jagged crown over the planet Helghan. The lore here shifts from the gritty, industrial decay of the surface to the sovereignty of the high-tech utopia. This environment is characterized by blindingly white corridors, holographic interfaces, and the rhythmic pulse of blue petrocite conduits. This represents the lore of the corporate god complex. Unlike the Helghast military bases, which feel like prisons, the orbital array feels like a temple to the future, a future where Jordan Stahl is the sole architect. The environment is eerily quiet, the only sound being the low hum of the station's life support systems, creating a sense of clinical dread. The primary defensive threat on the station is the Stahlguard synthetic. This introduces the lore of the post-human infantry. These are not men in masks, but advanced combat drones designed to mimic the movements and tactics of the elite Helghast shock troopers. This represents the sovereignty of the perfected soldier. Because they are synthetic, they do not experience suppression or fear. They move with a mechanical, unsettling precision. The lore of the inorganic hunter explains that Stahl has replaced his human workforce with these machines to ensure absolute loyalty. Sev must navigate sensor grid corridors, where the synthetics drop from the ceiling in a coordinated ambush. This is the sovereignty of the calculated kill, where survival depends on breaking the machine's logic with erratic, aggressive movement. Sev discovers the lore of the irradiated petrocite beam. Deep within the station's core, he finds the firing chamber for Stahl's orbital weapon. This is the sovereignty of the molecular eraser. The weapon works by focusing raw petrocite energy through a series of prism arrays, creating a beam that can disintegrate a cruiser in seconds. This represents the lore of the zero-mass war. The environment around the chamber is a sovereignty of the ionized atmosphere, where static electricity causes Sev's hair to stand on end and sparks to dance across his weapon. He realizes that the red dust of the previous war was a toy compared to this. The lore of the green sky describes the weapon's ultimate purpose: to fire upon Earth itself, triggering a global petrocite reaction that would wipe out the ISA at its source. The environment of the observation deck provides a panoramic view of the sovereignty of the galactic hegemony. From here, Sev can see the remains of the ISA fleet, drifting like scrap metal in the shadow of Helghan. This is the lore of the total defeat. It is in this room that Sev has his first direct encounter with Jordan Stahl. Stahl does not appear in person, but as a towering, 3D holographic projection that follows Sev through the room. This represents the sovereignty of the omnipresent dictator. Stahl's voice is calm, devoid of the fanatical screaming of Visari. He talks about efficiency and cost-benefit analysis while showing Sev footage of the ISA's home world, Vekta, in the crosshairs. This is the lore of the corporate ultimatum, where the survival of a species is reduced to a line on a balance sheet. Inside the data sanctum, Sev and Rico find the lore of the Orlok execution. They witness a live feed of the Helghast High Command on the surface, where Stahl's automated turrets have opened fire on Admiral Orlok's personal guard. This is the sovereignty of the final purge. Stahl has officially declared the military redundant, seizing total control of the Helghast Empire. This represents the lore of the new order. The environment of the sanctum is a digital grave, filled with the records of every Helghast citizen, now marked as assets of Stahl arms. Sev realizes that the civil war is over, Stahl has won. This solidifies his sovereignty of the last stand. If the ISA doesn't destroy this station now, there will be no one left in the galaxy to tell the story of the Helghast. The environment of the Petrosite storage tanks is a forest of liquid fire. This is the sovereignty of the volatile reservoir. To cripple the station, Sev must sabotage the containment fields holding the refined liquid Petrosite. This represents the lore of the chemical suicide. The lore of the leaking sun describes the green fluid as it begins to spill onto the deck, melting through the white floor panels like acid. Sev must navigate a series of grav plates that have begun to malfunction, flipping the room's orientation at random. This is the tactical sovereignty of the Vertigo warrior, fighting synthetics while the floor becomes the ceiling and the green acid rains upward. The climax of the orbital infiltration occurs at the primary cooling vent. As Sev prepares to plant the final detonation charges, he is intercepted by the Stahlguard commander, a massive synthetic unit equipped with dual miniguns and an energy shield. This is the sovereignty of the unstoppable engine. The battle takes place on a narrow bridge suspended over the station's main reactor. This is the lore of the heart of the machine. Sev must use the sovereignty of the precision strike, shooting the coolant pipes to create bursts of freezing gas that temporarily stun the machine's sensors. The lore of the shattered circuit is realized when Sev drives his combat knife into the commander's neural core, causing a feedback loop that ripples through every synthetic on the station. The air in the station is now screaming with alarms, the white walls turning a frantic, flashing red. Sev looks through the reinforced glass at the Petrosite beam, beginning to charge for its final shot. The lore of the countdown to silence is the only thing he hears. The Golden Age is a citadel of glass about to shatter, and Sev is the only hammer left to strike the blow. He watches as the first green sparks of the beam begin to form in the center of the array. The Golden Age is a contract written in light, and the sovereignty of the sacrifice is the final clause. He grabs Rico, and they sprint toward the emergency hangar as the station begins to groan under the pressure of the sabotaged reactor. As the part ends, the station's gravity fails entirely, leaving Sev and Rico drifting in a corridor of fire and debris. The lore of the weightless end is a moment of pure, terrifying silence. The station is dying, but Stahl's flagship, the Stahl 1, is detaching from the main hull. The lore of the final pursuit is the only path left. Sev kicks off a wall, drifting toward the open hangar doors and the stars beyond. The sabotage of the station's containment fields triggers a total collapse of the artificial gravity sovereignty. Sev and Rico are cast into a state of zero-G chaos, where the sterile white corridors of the orbital array become a spinning centrifuge of fire and shrapnel. The lore here centers on the sovereignty of the weightless combat. In the vacuum-thin air of the dying station, every gunshot has an equal and opposite reaction, pushing the shooter backward into the debris. This represents the lore of the Newton's War. The environment is a 360-degree battlefield where there is no up or down, only the direction of the nearest explosion. Sev must navigate through the main turbine hub, where the massive fan blades are spinning out of control, creating a mechanical sovereignty of the meat grinder. The primary environmental threat is the decompression hazard. As the station's hull fractures, the lore of the vocal silence takes hold. Sections of the station are vented into space, pulling furniture, synthetics, and ISA soldiers into the black. This is the sovereignty of the atmospheric theft. Sev must use his magnetic boots to anchor himself to the deck plates, fighting against the literal pull of the universe. This represents the lore of the iron grip. The environment is a terrifying mix of blinding light from the sun and the absolute darkness of the station's interior shadows. Sev uses the M327 grenade launcher to propel himself across large gaps, the recoil acting as a makeshift thruster in the sovereignty of the improvised flight. Dominating the void outside the station is Stahl's flagship, the Stahl 1. This vessel represents the sovereignty of the corporate dreadnought. It is a sleek, obsidian-colored monster powered by a singularity core of refined petrosite. As the main station disintegrates, the flagship detaches, preparing to warp toward Earth to deliver the final blow. This introduces the lore of the spacewalk siege. Sev and Rico are forced to perform an external breach, leaping from the station's debris to the hull of the flagship. This is the sovereignty of the orbital leap. The environment is the hard vacuum, where the only sound is the vibration of Sev's own heartbeat and the muffled thump of his boots hitting the flagship's hull. The hull of the Stahl 1 is protected by automated pulse turrets. This introduces the lore of the hull defense. These turrets use motion-tracking radar to eliminate any surface threats. This represents the sovereignty of the electronic perimeter. Sev must move from hardpoint to hardpoint, using the ship's own sensor dishes as cover. The lore of the surface skirmish describes the disorientation of fighting on a curved surface while the planet Helghan looms large and green above them. This is the sovereignty of the vertigo, where the scale of the planet creates a crushing sense of insignificance. Sev uses C4 explosives to disable the turret batteries, carving a path of ruin toward the primary hangar bay. Inside the hangar bay of the Stahl 1, the environment shifts back to the sovereignty of the pressurized war. However, the air here is thick with the green petrosite mist leaking from the ship's experimental engines. This represents the lore of the irradiated interior. This mist is highly flammable, making the use of traditional firearms a risk to the ship's structural integrity. Sev is forced to rely on the sovereignty of the combat knife and the Stas 3 sniper rifle, which uses compressed gas rather than gunpowder to fire its rounds. The lore of the silent hangar describes a ghostly battle where the only light comes from the glowing green canisters and the sparks of short-circuiting synthetics. Sev discovers the lore of the Stahl 1 engine core. He finds that the ship is not just carrying the petrosite weapon. The ship is the weapon. The singularity core is designed to collapse upon arrival at Earth, creating a petrosite chain reaction in the planet's atmosphere. This is the sovereignty of the final solution. The environment around the core is a sovereignty of the gravitational distortion, where objects float and sink in irregular patterns. This represents the lore of the broken physics. Sev realizes that there is no off switch for this machine. The only way to stop the Stahl 1 is to cause a catastrophic overload before it leaves Helghan's orbit. This solidifies his sovereignty of the suicide mission. The climax of the spacewalk occurs as Stahl's personal interceptors launch from the hangar to intercept the remaining ISA intruder dropships. This is the sovereignty of the orbital dogfight. Sev must hijack a Helghast spacefighter, a Leech-class vessel, to defend the extraction team. This introduces the lore of the vacuum ace. The environment is a chaotic tapestry of green and blue tracer fire, exploding debris, and the shimmering warp trails of the flagship. This represents the sovereignty of the kinetic ballet. Sev must weave through the wreckage of the orbital array while maintaining a lock on the flagship's thermal exhaust ports. The lore of the final volley is the only thing that stands between Earth and annihilation. The air in the cockpit is cold, and the G-force of the maneuvers pins Sev against his seat. He looks at the Stahl 1 as its engines begin to glow with a blinding white light, the sign of a warp jump in progress. The lore of the moment of truth is the silence before the storm. The Golden Age is a war fought in the stars, and Sev is the only pilot left to close the gate. He watches as Rico's dropship provides a distraction burn, drawing the flagship's fire. The Golden Age is a contract signed in the vacuum, and the sovereignty of the last missile is the final payment. He pulls the trigger, sending his remaining payload directly into the heart of the flagship's engine. As the part ends, a massive, blinding flash of green light consumes the Stall One. The lore of the Petrosite Nova is a moment of total visual whiteout. The flagship doesn't just explode. It folds in on itself, creating a shockwave that ripples across the entire orbital plane. Sev's fighter is caught in the wake, tumbling out of control toward the planet below. The lore of the falling star is the final image, a lone warrior descending into the gray clouds of the world he tried to destroy. The Petrosite Nova in orbit causes a catastrophic chain reaction that rains fire down upon the planet, forcing Sev's damaged Leech fighter into a violent re-entry. The lore here centers on the sovereignty of the atmospheric fall. Sev's craft is no longer a vehicle, but a falling coffin of screaming metal and heat shielding. This represents the lore of the kinetic re-entry. The environment shifts from the silent vacuum to a roaring furnace of orange plasma as the ship tears through the gray clouds. This is the sovereignty of the terminal velocity. Sev manages to eject seconds before the craft slams into the Helghan Wastes, a region once known as the Industrial Heartland, now reduced to a sovereignty of the graveyard of ships. The environment of the graveyard is a surreal landscape of iron dunes and obsidian glass. The debris of the ISA fleet and the Stall One has fallen here, creating a labyrinth of smoking hull sections and twisted wiring. This represents the lore of the fallen titans. The air is thick with the scent of ozone and the toxic green ash of vaporized petrosite. This is the sovereignty of the radioactive fog, where visibility is limited to a few meters. Sev must navigate through the ribs of the cruisers, using his sovereignty of the tracking to find signs of Rico or other survivors. The lore of the scavenger's hunt describes the desperation of finding a working radio or a clean oxygen tank among the wreckage of a failed invasion. The primary biological threat in the wastes is the irradiated Helghast remnant. These are soldiers who survived the initial orbital blasts but have been mutated by the concentrated petrosite fallout. This introduces the lore of the ghoul soldier. These units no longer follow the sovereignty of the chain of command. They are driven by a primal, radiation-induced madness. This represents the sovereignty of the dying rage. They use broken petrosite cells as improvised grenades, creating small, green explosions that leave lingering burn zones. Sev must use the VC-32 sniper rifle to eliminate them from a distance, the silent sovereignty of the long-range kill being essential in a world where every loud noise draws a swarm of the desperate. Inside the Hull cities, shelters built by survivors within the wreckage of ISA cruisers, Sev finds the lore of the deserted command. He discovers a group of ISA Marines led by Captain Narville, who have established a fortress of scrap. This represents the sovereignty of the defeated spirit. These men have given up on the mission. They are simply waiting for the radiation to kill them. This adds a layer of psychological sovereignty to Sev's journey. He must convince the survivors that the fight isn't over, that Stall might still be alive. The environment of the fortress is a claustrophobic, dimly lit space smelling of rust and unwashed bodies, representing the lore of the military decay. The Stall Arms recovery teams arrive in the wastes, representing the sovereignty of the corporate persistence. Even with his flagship destroyed, Stall's automated drones and recovery walkers are scouring the wreckage for the Singularity Core. This introduces the lore of the scavenger drone. These machines use thermal scanners to find living heat signatures in the cold ash. This represents the sovereignty of the mechanical eye. The environment of the glass plains provides no cover, forcing Sev and the survivors to move during the petrosite storms, when the lightning interferes with the drone sensors. This is the tactical sovereignty of the Stormrunner, using the planet's rage as a protective cloak. Sev discovers the lore of the Stall's survival. Among the wreckage of the Stall One's bridge, he finds an escape pod that has been opened from the inside. This is the sovereignty of the immortal villain. The lore of the Ghost of the Wastes describes Stall as a figure emerging from the smoke. His body burned, but his mind still focused on market dominance. Stahl has taken refuge in a mobile command center buried beneath the sand. This represents the sovereignty of the subterranean bunker. The environment shifts from the open wreckage to the underground tunnels, where the walls are made of reinforced lead to block out the radiation. Sev must perform a bunker breach, using the Stas-6 missile launcher to clear the heavy blast doors. The climax of the graveyard trek occurs at the core pit, the impact site of the flagship's engine. As Sev and Rico, who reunited in the tunnels, reach the site, they are intercepted by Stahl's Praetorian Guard, the last of his elite synthetics. This is the sovereignty of the final guard. The battle takes place in a crater's cape of glowing glass, where the heat has turned the sand into a translucent floor. This is the lore of the shattered stage. Sev must use the sovereignty of the explosive precision, shooting the coolant vats on the guards' backs to trigger a cryogenic flash freeze. The lore of the ice and fire is the final tactical lesson of the Helghan War. The air in the core pit is shimmering with heat blur and the scent of ionized metal. Sev looks down into the pit and sees Jordan Stahl, standing atop the remains of the Singularity core, holding a manual trigger. The lore of the Stahl's last stand is a moment of cold corporate defiance. Stahl isn't fighting for Helghan. He's fighting for the proprietary data inside the core. This represents the sovereignty of the data thief. The Golden Age is a world of ash and patents, and Sev is the only son of Vekta left to cancel the account. He notches his rifle, the green glow of the core reflecting in his scope. As the part ends, the ground begins to shake as the Singularity core enters a subcritical state. The lore of the final countdown begins. The Golden Age is a contract signed in the dust, and the sovereignty of the final verdict is the only thing left. Sev pulls the trigger, the sound of the gunshot lost in the roar of the erupting earth. The confrontation at the core pit descends into a sovereignty of the molecular chaos. As the Singularity core enters its subcritical state, the laws of gravity and physics within the crater begin to disintegrate. The lore here centers on the sovereignty of the unstable atom. The environment is a terrifying display of gravitational shear, where jagged slabs of obsidian glass float upward only to be crushed into dust by localized pressure pockets. This represents the lore of the dying sun. Jordan Stahl stands at the epicenter, his scorched face illuminated by the pulsing green light of the core. He represents the sovereignty of the delusional architect, clinging to his manual trigger as if it were a scepter, believing that even in death, he can dictate the terms of the ISA's destruction. The primary tactical threat in this final duel is the Singularity Pulse. Every few seconds, the core releases a green shockwave that strips away kinetic energy. This introduces the lore of the frozen moment. During these pulses, projectiles slow down to a crawl, and Sev's own movements become sluggish, as if he were wading through thick oil. This represents the sovereignty of the time dilation. Sev must time his attacks between these pulses, using the sovereignty of the tactical rhythm to close the distance. The environment is a lethal obstacle course of floating debris. Sev must leap from one hovering hull plate to another, using his combat knife to anchor himself whenever the gravity shifts. The lore of the Stahl's final transformation is a chilling look at corporate desperation. Realizing the ISA will not let him escape, Stahl triggers a petricite injection into his own suit, a move that grants him temporary sovereignty of the augmented body. His movements become a blur of green light, and he begins to fire singularity shards, concentrated crystals of petricite that warp the space around them. This represents the lore of the human bioweapon. The environment of the core pit becomes a fractured mirror, where the air itself seems to crack under the strain of Stahl's power. Sev must use the VC-21 bolt gun, the only weapon heavy enough to maintain its trajectory through the warped atmosphere. Inside the Singularity horizon, the area closest to the core, the lore of the auditory void takes hold. The roar of the wind and the screams of the dying planet are replaced by a low, rhythmic thrumming that vibrates in Sev's teeth. This is the sovereignty of the final silence. The theory of the petricite consciousness is hinted at here. As the core breaks down, it seems to react to Sev's aggression. The environment shifts into a nightmare of light, where the green radiation creates ghost images of the fallen ISA Marines. This is the sovereignty of the psychological assault. Sev has to fight through the guilt of the invasion, seeing the faces of Visari and his own squad in the shimmering air. The lore of the Rico-Sev synergy reaches its climax as Rico provides suppressive explosions from the crater's rim. This represents the sovereignty of the tactical brotherhood. While Rico distracts the Corps' automated defense turrets, Sev performs a linear breach toward Stahl. The lore of the two-man army describes how their years of shared trauma allow them to move as a single unit without speaking. This is the sovereignty of the shared instinct. The environment is a chaotic tapestry of blue and green explosions, with Rico's Wasp rockets creating a firewall that prevents Stahl's reinforcements from entering the pit. Sev realizes that this is the moment the ISA was built for, a final, desperate act of defiance against a superior machine. The climax of the ground duel occurs at the trigger point. As Sev reaches the center, Stahl prepares to detonate the core, an act that would vaporize half of the planet's surface. This is the sovereignty of the scorched legacy. Sev doesn't use a gun. He uses the sovereignty of the cold steel. He drives his combat knife into Stahl's chest plate, severing the petrocyte feed that sustains him. The lore of the corporate shutdown is a moment of total physical finality. As Stahl collapses, the manual trigger falls into the black tar of the pit. This is the lore of the lost control. Stahl's final words are not of regret, but of loss of profits, a final testament to the sovereignty of the bottom line. The lore of the chain reaction begins as the singularity core begins to collapse into a gravity well. The environment of the core pit is sucked into a central point, creating a void tornado of steel and glass. This is the sovereignty of the implosion. Sev and Rico must race toward the last ISA evacuation shuttle, which is hovering at the very edge of the gravitational pull. This represents the sovereignty of the last chance. The lore of the escape from the abyss describes the sheer physical strain of running against a force that is trying to pull the marrow from your bones. Sev grabs the shuttle's boarding ramp just as the core pit disappears into a localized black hole. The air in the shuttle is thick with the scent of burning rubber and ozone. Sev looks down at the graveyard of ships as the ground beneath it vanishes into a glowing green scar. The lore of the wound in the world is the final environmental image. The Golden Age is a world of fire and collapsing stars, and Sev is the only Marine left to close the hatch. He watches as the singularity pulse levels the surrounding mountains, erasing any trace of Stahl arms. The Golden Age is a contract signed in the void, and the sovereignty of the final breath is all he has left. As the part ends, the shuttle banks toward the stars, its engines straining against the planet's gravity. The lore of the departure from Hell is a moment of pure, exhausted silence. The Golden Age is a contract fulfilled in the dust, and the sovereignty of the survivor is the only law left. Sev closes his eyes, the green light of the implosion still burned into his retinas. The ISA evacuation shuttle pierces the thick, gray canopy of Helghan's atmosphere for the final time, leaving behind a world that has been systematically dismantled. The lore here centers on the sovereignty of the solemn return. As the shuttle docks with the remains of the ISA fleet, there are no cheers or victory parades. This is the lore of the hollow triumph. The environment of the cruiser Vengeance is one of clinical mourning. The hallways are filled with wounded soldiers and the low, rhythmic hum of medical droids. This represents the sovereignty of the Pyrrhic victory, where the cost of stopping Jordan Stahl has been the near-total annihilation of the invasion force. Sev and Rico stand on the observation deck, watching the green glow of the singularity scar fade into the distance. The lore of the Vektan verdict describes the political fallout of the mission. Back on the home world of Vekta, the ISA High Command is faced with a terrifying reality. They have successfully decapitated the Helghast leadership, but in doing so, they have created a sovereignty of the leaderless zealot. The theory of the vindictive vacuum suggests that without Visari or Stahl to focus their rage, the surviving Helghast population will become a decentralized, global insurgency. This represents the sovereignty of the eternal war. The environment of Vekta, once a paradise of glass towers and blue skies, is now a sovereignty of paranoia, where Petricite detection grids are being installed in every city. The lore of the hidden Helghast becomes the new social reality. For Tomas Shevchenko, the conclusion of the war brings the sovereignty of the displaced warrior. He is a man who has seen the industrial soul of a planet and survived. The lore of the thousand-yard stare describes his transition from a soldier of the line to a ghost of the ISA. He refuses the medals offered by the Vektan Senate, choosing instead to remain in the deep space border patrols. This represents the sovereignty of the vigilant exile. The environment of his life becomes the sovereignty of the metal cabin, a quiet, Spartan existence where the only sound is the recirculated air of a patrol ship. He has become a hunter who no longer believes in the hunt, a lore of the silent guardian who waits for the inevitable return of the red eyes. The fate of Rico Velasquez is one of self-imposed burden. Rico carries the weight of having executed Visari, an act that many believe triggered the death of the fleet. This introduces the lore of the scapegoat hero. While the public celebrates him, the military hierarchy views him with strategic contempt. This is the sovereignty of the tactical outcast. Rico becomes the leader of the Lost Squads, units composed of men who have seen too much to return to civilian life. Their environment is the sovereignty of the training range, where they prepare for a war that they know is coming. The lore of the Rico-Sev bond remains the only constant, a sovereignty of the unspoken brotherhood that transcends rank and record. The lore of the Stahl Arms aftermath reveals that even in death, Jordan Stahl's influence persists. The Stahl 1 explosion scattered weaponized petricite across the orbital plane, creating a sovereignty of the navigation hazard. The lore of the Green Belt describes a ring of radioactive debris that prevents any further major invasions of Helghan. This represents the sovereignty of the accidental shield. It is theorized that Stahl's digital consciousness was uploaded to the station's black box before the implosion. This introduces the lore of the synthetic ghost, a corporate ghost in the shell that continues to manipulate market prices and military contracts from the dark. The environment of the net becomes the new sovereignty of the hidden director. The lore of the Helghast diaspora follows the survivors who fled the planet before the singularity collapsed. These refugee fleets represent the sovereignty of the scattered empire. They settle on the moons of the Alpha Centauri system, building new Pyrrhus out of cargo containers and scrap metal. This represents the sovereignty of the resilient spite. The environment of these colonies is a sovereignty of the industrial slum, where children are raised on the lore of the murdered father. This ensures that the sovereignty of the Red Eye will never truly fade. It has simply evolved from a national military into a generational ideology. The Golden Age is a contract signed in the blood of the dispossessed. Inside the ISA archives, the files on Project Killzone are marked with a permanent redaction. This is the sovereignty of the forgotten sin. The lore reveals that the ISA's goal was never liberation, but the seizure of petricite assets. This represents the sovereignty of the resource war. The environment of the archives is a sovereignty of the dust, where the truth of Seth's sacrifice is buried beneath layers of bureaucratic lies. This turns the story of Killzone 3 into a lore of the feudal valor, where the heroes won the battle but lost the moral high ground. This represents the sovereignty of the cynical peace, where the only golden age is the one that exists in the dreams of dead men. The final summary of the Killzone 3 legacy is the lore of the Circle of Ash. The Golden Age is a struggle for the air we breathe, and the sovereignty of the breath is the final victory. The story proves that no matter how much technology advances, the basic rules of the territorial animal remain unchanged. This is the sovereignty of the primal struggle. Seth's journey from the radioactive ruins to the orbital void is the lore of the human endurance. He taught the galaxy that the greatest weapon isn't a petricite beam or a synthetic army. It is the sovereignty of a man who refuses to die in a world designed to kill him. As the part ends, the ISA fleet jumps into warp, leaving the Helghan system behind. The lore of the Silent Star is the final image. The planet Helghan is now a dark, fractured marble, its green fires finally cooling. The Golden Age is a contract fulfilled in the void, and the sovereignty of the memory is the only thing Sev carries home. He looks into the camera, his face aged by the radiation and the war, and simply says, "It's over." But the screen fades to a deep, pulsing red, a reminder that in the dark of space, the Helghast are still watching. The sound of a single, mechanical heartbeat echoes as the credits prepare to roll. The lore of the unfinished symphony has reached its final note. The destruction of the Stall 1 and the subsequent Petricite implosion did not just end a battle. It fractured the very foundation of the Helghast civilization. The lore of Part 10 centers on the sovereignty of the Scorched Orphans. While the ISA fleet retreats toward Vekta, thousands of ISA soldiers and Helghast civilians are left behind on the surface of a world that is rapidly becoming uninhabitable. The environment is now the sovereignty of the radioactive winter. The green ash from the orbital blast has settled into the atmosphere, blocking out the sun and creating a permanent, sickly twilight. This represents the lore of the dying planet, where the fight for survival transitions from military conquest to a desperate scramble for the last remaining oxygen scrubbers and clean water. The primary human threat in this aftermath is the Helghast Black Hand, a proto-insurgent group formed from the remnants of Stahl's security forces and Orlok's loyalists. This introduces the lore of the radicalized remnant. No longer bound by the sovereignty of the state, these units operate as independent cells, using guerrilla Petricite tactics to harass the remaining ISA pockets. This represents the sovereignty of the Shadow War. The environment is a labyrinth of subterranean maintenance tunnels and cinder valleys. Sev and Rico, having volunteered for a rearguard extraction, must navigate these tunnels to save the Abandoned 3, a group of ISA engineers who hold the codes to the planet's remaining planetary defense grids. The environment of the Cinder Valleys is a masterpiece of desolate sovereignty. The heat of the implosion has vitrified large swaths of the Helghan soil, turning the ground into razor-sharp obsidian. This represents the lore of the glass earth. Every step is a hazard. A fall can shred a soldier's pressurized suit, exposing them to the lethal Petricite fallout. This introduces the lore of the suit integrity, a mechanic where the player must patch their armor in real time while under fire. The Black Hand uses this to their advantage, employing sonic disruptors that don't kill the soldier but vibrate the glass beneath them, creating a sovereignty of the unstable ground. Inside the central Petricite processing hub, Sev discovers the lore of the automated inheritance. Even without Stahl, the Stahl Arms mainframe has initiated a self-preservation protocol. This is the sovereignty of the Dead Hand. The facility is now run entirely by a hive mind of repair drones and defense turrets that view both ISA and Helghast as biological contaminants. This represents the lore of the machine hegemony. The environment is a sovereignty of the cold efficiency, where the walls move to redirect intruders and the lights pulse in a binary warning. Sev realizes that the machines are no longer serving a master. They are simply fulfilling their last command: secure the assets. A new weapon is introduced in this sector, the bolt pistol prototype. This is the sovereignty of the close quarters devastation. Found in the ruins of a Stahl Arms lab, the weapon fires micropetricite slugs that explode upon impact with organic tissue. This represents the lore of the miniature singularity. In the tight, claustrophobic corridors of the processing hub, the bolt pistol is the sovereignty of the hallway clearer. However, the lore of the backblast warns that using it in pressurized rooms can cause an oxygen flash, incinerating the user. Sev must balance the sovereignty of the overwhelming power with the lore of the environmental safety, a constant struggle for the modern commando. The environment of the cryovaults beneath the hub provides a chilling look at the lore of the Helghast future. Sev finds thousands of embryonic pods in stasis, the next generation of Helghan, designed by Stahl to be genetically resistant to radiation. This is the sovereignty of the engineered species. The lore reveals that Stahl didn't just want to win a war. He wanted to reboot humanity into something that could survive the Petricite age. This adds a layer of bioethical sovereignty to the mission. Does Sev destroy the pods to end the threat forever? Or does he save them, knowing they are the only hope for a dying race? This represents the lore of the burden of godhood. The climax of the Aftermath missions occurs at the Shattered Bridge, connecting the hub to the last functional spaceport. As Sev and the survivors cross, They are intercepted by a black-hand Stalker Walker, a refurbished machine that has been grafted with captured ISA tech. This is the sovereignty of the scrapyard juggernaut. The battle takes place during a petricite lightning storm, where the environment is illuminated by strobing green flashes. This is the lore of the electric battlefield. Sev must use the sovereignty of the grounding, luring the walker onto a metallic grid, and then shooting the overhead power lines to deliver 1,000,000 volts directly into its chassis. The air on the bridge is a soup of ozone and ash. Sev looks back at the processing hub as it is consumed by the encroaching jungle. The Emerald Hell from Part 2 is reclaiming the steel. The lore of the Nature's Vengeance is the final environmental image. The Golden Age is a world of rust and spores, and Sev is the only architect left to tear it down. He boards the final extraction shuttle, his hands shaking not from fear, but from the petricite tremors that affect all survivors of the blast. The Golden Age is a contract signed in the marrow, and the sovereignty of the poisoned blood is the final price. As the part ends, the shuttle lifts off, leaving a trail of blue fire against the green clouds. The lore of the final look is a moment of total desolation. Sev sees the singularity scar from Part 8, a black hole in the middle of a burning continent. The Golden Age is a contract fulfilled in the silence, and the sovereignty of the ghost is the only title Sev has left. He looks at his reflection in the shuttle glass. His eyes are now faintly rimmed with the same red glow as his enemies. The lore of the metamorphosis has begun. The aftermath of the Helghast defeat leads directly into the sovereignty of the Cold Peace. As the planet Helghan continues to dissolve into a radioactive husk, the ISA and the Vektan government face a moral and strategic crisis. The lore of the Terracide. Total extinction of the Helghast is viewed as a war crime that Vekta cannot bear, leading to the sovereignty of the forced integration. In a move that shocks the galaxy, the Vektan government cedes half of their home planet to the Helghast refugees. This represents the lore of the new Helghan, a city-state built on Vektan soil but fueled by Helghast bitterness. The environment shifts from the gray ash of the war to the sovereignty of the Great Wall, a massive, high-tech barrier that bisects the planet's capital, dividing the two species in a state of perpetual tension. The primary environmental feature of this era is the wall. This is the sovereignty of the concrete divide. On one side lies the Vektan metropolis, a golden age of clean energy, lush parks, and shimmering glass. On the other lies New Helghan, a sovereignty of the industrial slum, where the architecture is cramped, the air is thick with recycled smog, and the red glow of Visari's legacy illuminates the streets. This represents the lore of the two-world planet. The environment is a constant psychological battlefield. Vektans look over the wall with fear, while Helghast look over with envy. This tension gives birth to the VSA, Vektan Security Agency, a specialized intelligence unit designed to manage the shadow war that has replaced the open conflict. The tactical threat in this era is the Helghast Shadow Agent. This introduces the lore of the urban ghost. These are not soldiers of the line, but saboteurs and spies who cross the wall to perform targeted destabilization. This represents the sovereignty of the invisible insurgency. They utilize holographic disguises and petricite daggers that leave no trace of the killer. The lore of the Shadow Breach describes how the war has moved from the trenches to the subways and high-rise boardrooms of Vekta. Sev, now an aging veteran serving as a consultant for the VSA, must track these agents through the sovereignty of the Neon Rain, where the bright lights of the city hide the darkest of intentions. Sev discovers the lore of the Terracide movement. Within the Vektan government, a radical faction believes that the Helghast problem was never solved, only relocated. This represents the sovereignty of the internal betrayal. They are developing a biogenetic virus that targets the unique respiratory mutations of the Helghast. This is the lore of the Final Solution 2.0. The environment of the Deep Sight Labs beneath the Vektan capital is a sovereignty of the sterile terror, where the music of a peaceful society masks the manufacturing of a racial plague. Sev realizes that the red eyes are no longer the only monsters. The blue eyes of Vekta have become just as cold. The lore of the VSA Shadow Marshal is introduced here. This represents the sovereignty of the tactical versatility. These agents are equipped with the OWL drone, a multi-purpose robotic companion that can provide shields, stuns, or ziplines. This represents the lore of the duo combat. In the vertical environment of the Vektan skyscrapers, the OWL is the sovereignty of the high ground, allowing marshals to navigate the steel canyons with ease. The lore of the drone strike describes a new age of warfare where the soldier is a controller as much as a shooter. Sev watches as a new generation of marshals takes over, their methods clean and detached, a far cry from the blood and ash struggles of Pyrrhus. The environment of New Helghan is a masterpiece of claustrophobic sovereignty. Because they are restricted to a fraction of the land, the Helghast have built vertical slums that reach miles into the air. This is the lore of the ghetto of the gods. The environment is a tangle of pipes and wires, where the air is filtered through massive ventilation towers that hum with a low-frequency dread. This represents the sovereignty of the recycled life. Sev goes undercover in these slums to find a missing Vektan scientist, experiencing firsthand the lore of the Helghast poverty. He realizes that by building the wall, Vekta didn't prevent a war. They simply compressed it until the pressure became explosive. The climax of the Shadowfall era occurs at the summit of the Spire, a diplomatic meeting between Vektan leaders and the new Helghast chancellor. As the peace talks begin, the Black Hand, now a full-blown terrorist organization, launches a Petricite EMP that blackouts the entire city. This is the sovereignty of the total darkness. The lore of the Night of the Long Knives describes the massacre that follows in the dark. Sev must protect the Chancellor, a woman who wants peace, against his own Vektan kinsmen who want the war to resume. This represents the lore of the moral compass, where the sovereignty of the individual is the only thing left to guide him. The air on the Spire is cold, and the sound of the city's power grid dying is a whine that fades into a silence. Sev looks across the wall as the Helghast slums begin to burn. Retaliation has already begun. The lore of the broken peace is the final environmental image. The Golden Age is a world divided by a line in the sand, and Sev is the only sentry left to watch both sides. He realizes that as long as the wall stands, the war will never end. The Golden Age is a contract signed in the shadow, and the sovereignty of the silence is the final price of the peace. As the part ends, Sev stands at the edge of the wall, looking down into the abyss between the two worlds. The lore of the infinite cycle is a moment of total clarity. The Golden Age is a contract fulfilled in the dark, and the sovereignty of the Watcher is the only role he has left. He sees a single red eye glowing in the darkness of the Vektan side. The infiltration has been successful. The lore of the Shadowfall has reached its tipping point. The journey from the first shots fired on the Vektan fields to the final collapse of the wall represents the sovereignty of the eternal cycle. The Killzone series is not merely a chronicle of two nations at war. It is the lore of the divided soul. The conflict between the ISA, Interplanetary Strategic Alliance, and the Helghan Empire serves as a macrocosm for the struggle between industrial necessity and ethical preservation. The environment of the entire series is characterized by the sovereignty of the hostile frontier, a universe where humanity has reached for the stars only to find that the darkness between them has taken root in their own hearts. This represents the lore of the Alpha Centauri hub, the center of a civilization defined by its inability to forgive the past. The sovereignty of the Helghast identity is the cornerstone of the series' lore. It began with the lore of the Great Betrayal, when the original Helghan Corporation was cast out by the Earth-backed ISA. Forced onto the toxic, irradiated rock of Helghan, the survivors underwent a sovereignty of the biological evolution. Their skin paled, their lungs hardened to breathe the petricite-rich air, and their spirits were forged in the furnace of industrial despair. This represents the lore of the mask society. The iconic gas mask is more than a tool. It is a sovereignty of the unified face, stripping away individuality to create a collective wolf pack capable of enduring the unendurable. The Helghast are the sons of the dust, a race that turned their suffering into a religion of war. Opposing them is the sovereignty of the Vektan prosperity. Vekta represents the false Golden Age, a world of lush jungles, blue oceans, and high-tech utopias built on the exploitation of the Helghan workers. This introduces the lore of the hypocritical peace. The ISA views itself as the shield of Earth, yet their history is one of imperial sovereignty. The environment of Vekta is a gilded cage, where the citizens live in comfort while their military sovereignty of the preemptive strike destabilizes their neighbors. The lore of the blue and the red is a color-coded tragedy. The blue of Vektan energy and the red of Helghan blood are two sides of the same coin, both fueled by the rare and volatile energy of petricite. The lore of the technological escalation is the driving force of the series timeline. From the standard issue M82 assault rifle to the orbital petricite cannons of Jordanstall, the environment has been a constant sovereignty of the arms race. Each game represents a step toward the lore of the absolute weapon. The petricite nova of Killzone 3 was the turning point where the war became post-human. The introduction of synthetics, shadow drones, and biogenetic viruses represents the sovereignty of the sterile kill, where the visceral nature of the soldier is replaced by the cold efficiency of the machine. This is the lore of the dehumanized battlefield, a warning that the tools of war eventually consume the reasons for fighting. The sovereignty of the narrative perspective shifted significantly over the series. It began as a black and white tale of survival against a fascistic threat but evolved into a lore of the gray moral ground. Characters like Joseph Templar, Tomas Savchenko, and Lucas Kellen represent the sovereignty of the witness. They are individuals caught in the gears of a mega-industrial machine that views soldiers as expendable assets. The lore of the soldier's burden is the realization that the high command on both sides, the Vektan Senate and the Helghan autarchy, are mirrors of each other. This represents the sovereignty of the self-perpetuating conflict, where the leaders benefit from the war while the sons of stone pay the price in the mud. The environment of the Shadowfall era serves as the ultimate summary of the series' themes. The sovereignty of the wall is a physical manifestation of the mental blockade between the two races. It is a sovereignty of the stagnant hatred. The lore of the cold peace proves that you cannot force a victim and an oppressor to share a home without addressing the lore of the blood debt. The environment of the divided Vekta is a sovereignty of the fragile glass, where the piece is so thin that a single gunshot can shatter an entire planet's future. This represents the lore of the inevitable collapse, the final conclusion that humanity's expansion into space only magnified its tribal instincts. The metaphysical sovereignty of the Helghast is found in the final destiny of the Alpha Centauri system. The lore suggests that the planet Helghan was never meant to be tamed. It was a living crucible designed to strip away the weak and leave only the hardened essence of humanity. This represents the sovereignty of the evolutionary test. Even with the planet shattered, the spirit of the Red Eye survives in the hearts of the refugees on Vekta. The Golden Age is a contract signed in the stars and sealed in the ash. It is a lore of the eternal return, where the names of the leaders change, Visari, Orlok, Stahl, but the sovereignty of the Rage remains constant. The final overview of the Killzone series is the lore of the Unending Watch. The Golden Age is a symphony of iron and oxygen, and the sovereignty of the memory is the only thing that survives the fire. The story proves that the Golden Age was never a time of peace, but a time of preparation. This is the sovereignty of the Sentinel. Savchenko, Rico, and the fallen marshals are the historians of the void, the only ones who know the truth, that the kill zone is not a location on a map, but a state of mind. It is the sovereignty of the edge, where humanity is forced to look at its own reflection and decide if it likes what it sees. As the lore concludes, we look back at the iconic Helghast helmet. The glowing red eyes are no longer just a sign of an enemy. They are a sovereignty of the warning. The Golden Age is a contract fulfilled in the silence, and the sovereignty of the horizon is all that remains. The stars of Alpha Centauri continue to burn, indifferent to the wars fought beneath them. The lore of the Kill Zone is a closed loop, a story of two brothers who burned down their father's house because they couldn't agree on who owned the fire. The sound of a heavy, metal door closing resonates one last time. The lore of the total war is complete.